Aegon Targaryen was born into a world of dragonlords, a world where towering spires of fused stone and dragonfire reached skyward across the Valyrian peninsula. From the moment he drew his first breath, the boy inhaled the thick, warm air of Valyria's might, a civilization that had flourished for thousands of years, building its empire on the backs of dragons and the cunning of its aristocracy. He had no memory of a time before the great basalt roads that radiated from the freehold, nor of a Valyria that had not already become the center of the known world. His father, Aerion Targaryen, was a lesser scion of one of the countless noble families that hailed from the peninsular city. Yet even lesser was a relative term among the Valyrian elite. Every family that wore the silvery hair and violet eyes of true Valyrian stock boasted at least some modicum of wealth, influence, and magical knowledge. The Targaryens, albeit not the mightiest in the oldest councils of the freehold, were nevertheless recognized for their lineage of formidable dragon riders, their brood rumored to trace back to some of the earliest conjurations that had first bound dragons to human will. In a land that would never experience the doom, so widely feared in distant prophecies and half-heard rumors, Aegon would one day thrive, unburdened by the cataclysm that, in another timeline, might have obliterated them all. The boy's early years were full of wide eyes and hush-voiced wonder. He was seldom found without his two sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, both older, though not by many years, and both of them reflected the fierce pride and ambition that had carried their bloodline through countless generations. Together, the three wandered the vast Targaryen manse, located along one of Valyria's many twisting rivers. The estate was not so grand as those belonging to the more ancient or more powerful families, but it was large enough to house 100 servants, dragon keepers, scribes, and tutors. Aegon found delight in slipping away from his minders, exploring hidden corridors and trotting across narrow balconies high above the city streets. From such heights, he glimpsed the braziers dotting the roads below, saw the silhouettes of distant dragons swirling in the sky, and realized, though only as a child might, the sheer grandeur of his homeland. Valyria was a labyrinth of wonders. Markets brimming with exotic goods from all over Essos and even some corners of Westeros, marvels of sorcery in everyday life, and an array of dragons that soared overhead, each one fiercely loyal to a particular noble house. In the bustling streets, one could hear a dozen tongues being spoken by slaves, travelers, envoys, and freedmen alike. The tongue of old Valyria remained the noble speech, of course, but a man might hear the Slavers' Bay dialect, the brazen cadences of the Rhoyne, the older tongues of Sarner, and dialects from the Summer Islands. Valyria's empire spanned continents. There was no corner of the known world that had not seen the pale-haired conquerors land upon their shores, demanding fealty or tribute, often both. Even so, for the Targaryen children, life felt contained and insulated by the thick black walls of their manse. They had tasks and lessons and endless genealogies to memorize, plus their earliest flight lessons to attend. The older sister, Visenya, was proud and quiet, prone to fierce outbursts when pressed. Rhaenys, though just as intelligent, was gentler in her approach. Her laughter was free, she wore her heart upon her sleeve, and she had a notable gift for kindness that few in Valyria would have described as typical for a dragonlord's kin. Aegon loved both his sisters in ways that might have been considered scandalous in other corners of the world. Yet among Valyrians, the pure bloodlines were everything. Incest among siblings, cousins, uncles, and nieces was not only common but expected, ensuring the potency of the blood of the dragon endured. Still, in those early days, the three siblings were children first. Such matters were spoken of in whispers by the older generations and were not yet the children's chief concern. Aegon was physically lean and tall for his age, with a sharpness in his eyes that belied his youth. The old tutors saw potential in him that had little to do with his Valyrian blood and more to do with his spirit. He absorbed knowledge quickly, concerning matters of battle, flight, ancient runes, and especially the intricacies of politics. He was not the type to interrupt a teacher. He would watch and listen, storing away details in that quicksilver mind of his. Sometimes he would wake at dawn to witness the dragons being fed. He found a savage beauty in it. The swirl of serpentine bodies, the thunderous flap of leathery wings, the roar of living flame that cooked an entire bull alive in seconds. And then afterward, the acrid smell of burnt flesh and the sizzle of molten fat dripping from razor-sharp fangs. It was horrifying and awe-inspiring in equal measure, a living testament to Valyria's power. In this world without the doom, the old city glistened with the fruits of centuries of magical and practical ingenuity. At the center rose the city's Temple of Flame, an open structure ringed by columns carved to resemble coiled dragons. Priests and sorcerers alike went there to commune with the old gods of Valyria. For though the Valyrians worshipped no single deity, they believed in forces that demanded sacrifice and homage. The Targaryens, devout in their own particular brand of faith, paid respects by offering a portion of their greatest hunts to the fires. Aerion Targaryen, who often took his son to observe the rites, insisted that Aegon stand strong in the face of the swirling vapors and choking incense. "Hold your head high, boy," he would say. "The flame does not wait for the weak." And Aegon learned to do so even as a child. He grew to admire the flickering tongues of heat that danced in the braziers, imagining in them the shapes of dragons. With every cycle of the red moon, the boy felt something resonate in his blood. A humming, a clarion call that connected him to the beasts overhead. Because the doom never came, the Targaryens had no reason to flee to Dragonstone. Their lesser status among the great houses of Valyria never blossomed into the overshadowing pride it might have if they had been the last surviving Valyrian dragonlords. Instead, they worked for decades to maintain alliances with stronger families like the Valerians, the Celtigars, and older branches that had not yet died out. Their own seat remained in the heart of the freehold, a vantage from which they could watch and learn from the mightiest of the dragon riders. And watch they did. Visenya rode a fearsome green-scaled dragon called Valyries, whose name meant emerald flame in the old tongue. She had claimed the beast when she turned 13, with minimal injuries and no shortage of whispered admiration from other families. Rhaenys, equally bold though less outwardly fierce, claimed a slender, sky-blue drake named Vaelith. It was said that Vaelith's flames burned even hotter than Valyries's, though few dared to test that rumor. For Aegon, a single dragon had loomed in his imagination since he was old enough to understand what it meant to be a dragonlord. Valyrian, known to some as the Black Dread. The monstrous beast was rumored to be among the largest in all Valyria, an ancient dragon who had survived centuries, if not longer. But Valyrian was not of the Targaryen stables. The fearsome creature belonged to another branch of the family, more closely tied to a powerful consortium in the city. At times, Aegon's father or mother would mention the impossibility of him ever claiming such a beast as Valyrian, and yet something in Aegon's eyes burned each time the subject arose. A quiet, steady determination that said, "Why not?" Years passed. The Targaryen siblings grew from curious children to confident adolescents. They studied at the War College of Valyria, learned from the best swordsmen the city could offer, and even gleaned fragments of sorcery from the ancient texts kept in the deeper libraries. At formal events, Aegon watched how the older lords and ladies jockeyed for position, forging alliances one year and discarding them the next. He saw how those with the most powerful dragons held the highest seats in the councils, and how they wrestled over the building of new roads, the opening of new mines, and the expansions of their territory deeper into Essos. Without the doom, Valyria's grip on its empire was as strong as ever. Cities across the sea yearned for independence but rarely found the nerve to test the might of dragons. The free cities, Bravos, Volantis, Pentos, Myr, Lys, Tyrosh, and others, paid homage through taxes, tributes, and the acceptance of Valyrian governors who oversaw their affairs. Slavery thrived, fueling the empire's constant need for labor in its mines, fleets, and construction projects. Indeed, the entire Valyrian peninsula bristled with activity. Out of the forges came the renowned Valyrian steel, the forging secrets of which were guarded with an almost religious fervor. On the backs of dragons, the Valyrian lords soared to conquer new lands or to quash rebellions in old ones. The Targaryens were no exception. Aegon embarked on several such campaigns alongside Visenya and Rhaenys, though in the beginning, he was not yet permitted to ride a dragon of his own. He had not claimed one. Instead, he rode behind Visenya, clutching her waist as her green dragon dove into the swirling chaos of battle. He discovered that war, from the back of a dragon, was almost a separate language. Commands were roared against the hurricane of wind and the ear-splitting shriek of draconic fury. Everything smelled of smoke and burnt flesh. At night, the skies glowed with the aftershocks of immolated armies. But Valyria's campaigns were not always so savage. Sometimes negotiations, sealed with the display of a dragon perched upon a hillside, were enough to bring rebellious lords to their knees. Aegon found it fascinating how the mere promise of dragonfire could shape politics more effectively than any amount of gold or whispered threat. It was a dance of intimidation that the Valyrian aristocracy had practiced for centuries. He was 17 when at last he earned the chance to claim a dragon of his own. By then, Visenya was well known among their peers as a fierce warrior, her face half in shadow behind the tall crest of her Valyrian steel helm. Rhaenys, no less formidable, had charmed half the city with her laughter and cunning, forging alliances through dinners, feasts, and well-placed compliments that swayed hearts more effectively than threats. Aegon, for all his quiet intensity, had not yet come into his own. He felt an undercurrent of impatience, a sense that he stood at the edge of something monumental. The night before his claiming ceremony, he joined his father in a private courtyard, lit by the bluish glow of an arcane brazier. Aerion Targaryen seldom smiled, but there was pride in his eyes that night as he looked upon his son. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked, his voice low. "The stirring in your blood, the knowledge that tomorrow you may find your bond." Aegon merely nodded. Words felt insufficient to describe the swirl of hope and anxiety within him. If he failed to claim a dragon, if he walked away burned or dead or otherwise rejected, it would be a humiliation that might haunt him for life. But if he succeeded, he would ascend to the rank of a true dragonlord, worthy of a seat in Valyria's councils and wars. The next day, a hush fell over the Targaryen grounds. The claiming of a dragon was a sacred rite, performed under the auspices of the family's elders. Dozens of lesser dragons nested among the Targaryen stables and roosts, some newly hatched, some nearing ancient. Aegon walked through the grounds in slow, measured steps, his silver hair tied back, his face stoic. Visenya and Rhaenys watched from a lofty balcony, flanked by their mother. Lords and ladies, both Targaryen and allied families, stood in attendance, curious to see if the quiet boy they knew would prove himself that day. One after another, the dragons slithered forward at the coaxing of their keepers. Aegon stood firm, letting the creatures approach him, sniff him with smoking nostrils, and regard him with glowing, slitted eyes. Some were uninterested, turning away with a huff. Others lurched forward, snapping their jaws in a challenge that forced him to retreat. This was normal in the claiming process, a test of wills. Aegon's heart hammered in his chest every time a monstrous head loomed over him, filling his nostrils with sulfur and brimstone. He tried to summon that quiet determination within himself, remembering all the lessons he'd learned. He reached out, letting his hand rest upon the scaled neck of a mid-sized dragon named Gareth. But though Gareth did not recoil, the dragon offered no deeper spark of connection. There was tolerance, perhaps, but not a bond. Hours seemed to pass as Aegon moved among the stables, his back soaked with sweat, his mind churning. Then he saw it, a massive shape, half hidden behind a cluster of lesser drakes. A monstrous form of black scales and red accents, spines like a row of wicked lances. A low rumble rolled across the ground as the beast shifted. Valyrian, the Black Dread. He had not expected to see Valyrian here, for that colossal dragon was nominally claimed by Tyrion Targaryen, an older cousin rumored to be losing his strength to a creeping sickness. The keepers, apparently, had freed Valyrian from the cousin's claim at Tyrion's own request, for the old man recognized that he no longer commanded the dragon's respect. The hush in the courtyard deepened as Valyrian ambled forward, each step sending vibrations through the stones. Torchlight danced across the black scales, revealing scars from countless battles. The wide, reptilian eyes fixed on Aegon. The crowd murmured with excitement and fear. A single jet of flame could have immolated Aegon in an instant. He took a step forward. His muscles were tight with fear, but something within him thrummed, almost as though it recognized the beast. Valyrian lowered his head, nostrils flaring, exhaling hot breath that smelled of death and ashes. Aegon slowly raised a hand. The hush turned into a collective intake of breath among the onlookers. Then, as his hand settled on the dragon's snout, the tension broke. Aegon felt a warmth run through him that had nothing to do with heat. He felt power. He felt destiny. In that moment, Valyrian allowed him to touch, to claim, without protest. The courtyard erupted in shouts of amazement. Some called it madness. Others called it fate. But all recognized that Aegon Targaryen had succeeded in forging a bond with one of the most fearsome dragons in the Freehold. Tyrion, watching from a distance, nodded with something resembling relief. The old cousin recognized that Valyrian had chosen anew, and that choice was absolute. From that day forward, Aegon's life changed. He was no longer that quiet Targaryen boy, but the rider of Valyrian, the Black Dread. When he soared across the skies, the city of Valyria turned its eyes to watch him pass. Whispers followed him everywhere. Some said he was blessed by the old gods of the Freehold, others that he was fated for greatness or ruin. Either way, the Targaryens rose a notch higher in the tapestry of Valyrian nobility. Invitations poured in for feasts, hunts, and tournaments. The older families, who once barely spared a glance for the Targaryens, now vied for Aegon's attention. Yet, through it all, he remained much the same, quiet, observant, and fiercely loyal to his sisters. Visenya teased him that he was finally living up to the potential they always suspected in him. Rhaenys marveled at how he did not let the new fame go to his head. Between the three of them, there was a rare closeness, a bond that transcended the usual politicking so common among Valyrian siblings. In the years that followed, Aegon led or participated in multiple campaigns to maintain Valyria's dominion across Essos. He would descend upon rebellious city-states with Valyrian's fire turning midnight into dawn. He became known for his strategic cunning, often negotiating surrender with a minimal show of force. But if negotiations failed, he had no qualms about unleashing Valyrian's fury. He stood at the forefront of expansions into the grasslands to the east, ensuring that any would-be challengers bent the knee to Valyria rather than contest the unstoppable might of dragons. Despite his success, Aegon found himself increasingly unsettled by the cruelty he witnessed. Valyria had grown so large, so powerful, that it treated the peoples of Essos as little more than raw materials, lumber, or slaves to feed the machine of empire. Aegon's sisters noticed his disquiet. Visenya counseled him to harden his heart, for that was the Valyrian way. Rhaenys, kinder by nature, admitted that she too sometimes questioned the methods their people used to maintain power. And yet, they were Valyrians, heirs to a proud tradition older than many civilizations. Challenging that tradition was not a simple matter. Still, seeds of doubt lingered in Aegon's mind. On one occasion, during a punitive expedition near the River Rhoyne, he witnessed entire villages put to the torch for refusing to pay tribute. Dragon riders from the older houses laughed as they scattered peasants to the winds, hunted them down like animals, and took survivors as newly collared slaves. Aegon did his duty but refused to take part in needless cruelty. When he confronted an older lord about the wanton destruction, the man merely shrugged. "Such is the way of the world, boy. If they had a dragon, they'd do the same to us." Aegon pondered that cold logic long afterward. Strength was everything in Valyria. Might and the willingness to use it was what had built the empire. Could there be another way? He did not know. He only knew he could not ignore the question forever. Meanwhile, at home, the Targaryens found themselves entangled in the web of Valyrian politics. Alliances shifted, families rose and fell from grace. The Targaryens, thanks to Aegon's mounting prestige, were courted by multiple families seeking marriage ties. Visenya seemed determined to keep the blood pure, hinting that she might marry Aegon herself when the time was right. Rhaenys, too, was occasionally teased with the notion, but she flushed and changed the subject, uncertain of whether that was truly the path she desired. They were all taught that sibling marriage was the highest form of devotion to Valyria's tradition, ensuring the blood of the dragon remained undiluted. And yet, for all the acceptance of it, the Targaryen siblings remained cautious. They were bound by more than the prospect of marriage. They shared a vision for the future, a sense that the Targaryen family might carve its own destiny beyond the machinations of more powerful clans. As the seasons turned and Aegon's 20s dawned, word reached the freehold of Stirring across the narrow sea. In the land of Westeros, petty kings were locked in endless squabbles for dominion. Dorne, the Reach, the Stormlands, the North, the Vale, and the Iron Islands each had their own king, each claiming to be the greatest in the realm. Valyria paid little heed to Westeros normally. It was a continent far across the sea, and while some trade found its way across, it was not considered particularly wealthy or advanced. The few Valyrian outposts on the western continent existed mainly for trade with Oldtown or Lannisport, but direct conquest was seen as unnecessary. Yet, the Targaryens had a distant tie to Westeros through an old outpost on Dragonstone, an island off the coast of the Blackwater Bay. Generations ago, a Targaryen ancestor had claimed it, though it was more a foothold for trade than a serious attempt at expansion. With the freehold strong and no doom looming, that outpost remained in Targaryen hands, though it was seldom visited except for the occasional official dispatch. One evening, Aegon and his sisters sat around a polished black table in the Targaryen manse, reviewing scrolls that detailed the state of affairs in Westeros. The old caretaker of Dragonstone had sent word that the petty kings were at war once more, burning each other's fields and sacking towns. Visenya's eyes flicked over the parchment. "Savages," she murmured. "They war over scraps." Rhaenys set aside another scroll, which contained reports of rumored wealth in the Westerlands. Gold mines that made House Lannister wealthy, or so the caretaker wrote. She tapped her chin. "If Valyria ever turned its full attention there, I suspect they'd kneel as quickly as anyone else. A handful of swordsmen cannot stand against dragons." Aegon leaned back in his seat, glancing at the flickering torchlight that cast shadows on the black stone walls. "We have enough conquests here. Why would we bother with a half-tamed land across the sea? There's little to gain that we cannot already import." Visenya shrugged. "Perhaps the freehold has no reason, but do we?" Rhaenys looked at her older sister. "What are you suggesting?" Visenya's violet eyes gleamed. "I'm suggesting that if we truly wish to carve out our own legacy, free of the endless jockeying here in Valyria, we might consider forging our own kingdom somewhere else. Across the sea, for instance." Aegon took a moment to consider her words. The idea was bold, treasonous even, to break free from the freehold's direct authority and carve out an independent domain in Westeros. Yet was it truly so treasonous? Valyria was vast, and the Targaryens were just one family among many. There was little impetus for them to remain if they truly wished to expand their power. The old ancestor's seat at Dragonstone might serve as a perfect staging ground. He glanced at Rhaenys, who read the unspoken question in his gaze. "We would need more than just 3 dragons. Westeros is large. Even though they have no dragons of their own, they might unite if they felt threatened by an outside invasion." "Maybe," Visenya admitted, "but has that ever stopped us?" Though the notion excited them, it also stirred caution. The Targaryens were not the supreme lords of Valyria. If they tried to strike out too openly, the older and more powerful families might feel threatened, or might suspect the Targaryens of growing ambitions that could destabilize the freehold's hierarchy. And indeed, although Valyria was strong, it was also deeply fractured in its own way, thousands of families, each with dragons, each with an unyielding desire for supremacy or at least self-preservation. Over the next year, the siblings discussed the Westeros question often, never quite coming to a resolution. Meanwhile, they continued their duties in Essos, subduing rebellions and forging alliances. Aegon gained respect as an even-handed ruler in newly claimed territories. He was known for punishing the guilty severely but also extending mercy to those who bent the knee. He did not relish cruelty the way some of his Valyrian peers did. That distinction set him apart. Some found it admirable, others considered it a weakness. One fateful evening, Aegon received word that certain factions within Valyria had begun to resent his growing fame and power. A cousin from House Targaryen, a sly man named Malix, confessed that jealous whispers circulated among the older lords, implying that Aegon's bond with Balerion had made him too bold. Some suspected that the Targaryens might one day challenge the old families for control of the freehold. Visenya, upon hearing this, grew enraged and vowed to defend their rights through fire and blood if necessary. But Aegon counseled patience. "We cannot fight them all," he said. "Not in their own city." Rhaenys offered a calmer perspective. "If they think we are too ambitious, we might feed that rumor carefully. Let them think we are interested in other lands, not the freehold itself. That might ease tensions." Visenya arched a brow. "You suggest we deliberately hint that we plan to expand our presence in Westeros, so that the older families lose interest in us here?" Rhaenys shrugged. "If we seem ready to depart, perhaps they will not see us as a threat. They might even let us go, thinking we'll be the freehold's presence there and funnel wealth back to them." The three siblings shared a look. It might be the perfect solution. They could slip away from the labyrinth of Valyrian politics, focus on forging their own path in Westeros, and still maintain nominal ties to the freehold. Aegon rubbed his chin, recalling the savage petty wars described in the Caretaker's scrolls. "It will not be easy," he said at last, "to subdue an entire continent, but we have dragons, and the older families here would not easily follow us overseas. They'd have their own lands and threats to worry about." The seeds of a grand plan took root. Carefully, quietly, the Targaryens began to consolidate their wealth. They sold lesser holdings in the city, purchased ships, and secured alliances with a few other families that might one day benefit from trade routes to Westeros. A few of the powerful older houses took notice, but as Rhaenys predicted, they seemed more relieved than concerned. Let the Targaryens seek new challenges abroad. They hardly needed more competition for seats in Valyria's councils. In an alternate timeline, the doom would have forced the Targaryens to flee to Dragonstone as refugees, the last survivors of Valyria. But here, there was no fiery cataclysm, no sudden apocalypse. Instead, Aegon's departure was a conscious choice, shaped by a desire to escape the endless power struggles and find a realm they could rule outright. And because Valyria was at peace, albeit a predatory peace for the subjugated territories, no one thought it unusual for a younger family to test their fortunes across the sea. Thus, a small armada left Valyria one day, carrying the Targaryen siblings, their household, and, crucially, their dragons. Many minor knights and sellswords from Essos joined the expedition, eager for the promise of new lands to conquer and plunder. Valyria scarcely noticed the departure, for the empire continued to swell with other campaigns. Only a few hawk-eyed rivals guessed that Aegon and his sisters might be up to something grander than a mere adventure. When Aegon first set eyes upon Dragonstone, he found it both dreary and magnificent. The castle, carved of ancient black stone with gargoyles and dragon motifs, was perched on a volcanic island. Sulfur vents and hot springs dotted the rocky terrain, giving it a vaguely Valyrian ambience. In truth, the fortress had been built by Valyrian hands centuries earlier, a testament to the empire's reach even then. It was large enough to house an army, and stable a small flight of dragons. The Targaryens made it their new home, quickly refurbishing the old halls. They set up a court of their own, enthroned in a grand chamber lined with ornate dragon carvings. The local fisherfolk and traders were overawed by the arrival of multiple dragons, creatures they had only heard of in distant stories. Aegon wasted no time in sending scouts across the narrow sea to gather intelligence on the political situation in Westeros. Meanwhile, he and his sisters flew overhead, surveying the coastline, learning the lay of the land. Word soon spread across Westeros that a Valyrian prince, some called him a king, had set up court on Dragonstone, accompanied by dragons. The local lords and petty kings, each suspicious of the other, viewed this new presence with a mixture of curiosity and dread. It had been many years since any Valyrian had taken direct interest in their continent. They whispered that these Targaryens might seek to carve out a domain, but they disagreed on whether to confront them or ignore them until forced to act. That ignorance cost them. Over the next 2 years, Aegon quietly built alliances with minor lords along the Blackwater Bay who sought the advantage of dragon-backed power in their local feuds. He also made contact with merchants in Old Town eager for direct trade with Valyria. The presence of the Targaryens on Dragonstone was slowly normalizing. Yet behind the scenes, Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys meticulously studied the power structures of Westeros, how many men each king could field, what their alliances were, the strategic points that could be taken to quickly force submission. Valyrian's thunderous wings became a common sight in the skies above Dragonstone. Aegon would sometimes fly inland, not to devastate, but to observe. He learned the roads, the rivers, the plains, and the mountains. Visenya joined him on Valyries. Rhaenys followed on Valyth. They rarely stayed long enough to invite open conflict, returning to Dragonstone before any local force could muster against them. Word traveled that these Valyrian visitors seemed more curious than anything. Some said they were mapping the realm to launch a grand invasion. Others scoffed at the idea. Westeros was large, and these Targaryens had only 3 dragons. In time, small skirmishes erupted. One petty king of the narrow seacoast, the so-called King of Crackclaw Point, made a foolish attempt to capture Targaryen bannermen who had landed to negotiate a trade agreement. Aegon responded by leading a swift assault, with Balerian's flame reducing the man's keep to molten rubble. The king's vassals swore immediate fealty, preferring to live under Targaryen rule than to die in an inferno. This was Aegon's first real taste of conquest in Westeros, and it was shockingly easy. The local men had no real answer to Dragonfire. The bows and spears that might have served them against other armies were useless against an enemy who attacked from above. Aegon found the victory sobering rather than exhilarating. Here, more than in Essos, he felt a sense that they could reshape the entire land if they chose. Yet with that power came the weight of responsibility, a notion not often shared by Valyrian lords. He gathered his sisters in Dragonstone's throne room, which had once belonged to ancient Valyrian princes. The chamber was lit by braziers fashioned in the shapes of dragons. Smoke curled around the intricately carved columns, and the Targaryen banner, a red dragon on black, hung behind the dais where the 3 siblings took their seats. Standing before them were a handful of local lords who had pledged fealty, a coterie of Essosi sellswords, and a growing retinue of administrators who managed the castle. Aegon addressed the assembly in the common tongue, which he had diligently practiced. He declared that the Targaryens had come not merely to trade, but to bring order and prosperity to these lands, if the people would only submit to their rule. He spoke of forging alliances, ensuring peace, and curbing the endless squabbles among petty kings. He promised that those who joined willingly would be treated fairly, while those who resisted would face Dragonfire. It was a harsh ultimatum, couched in language of justice and unity. In truth, it was standard Valyrian imperial rhetoric, except shaped by Aegon's more tempered approach. The local lords, eager for stability, murmured among themselves. Some placed their hopes in Targaryen might, envisioning themselves as the first to bend the knee, thus securing favor. Others harbored private doubts, uncertain if the Targaryens could truly overthrow every petty king in Westeros. But none dared speak openly against the dragons looming just beyond the castle walls. Over the coming months, the Targaryens set their plan in motion. Aegon led a vanguard force onto the mainland, aiming for the Blackwater region. Visenya and Rhaenys each took to the skies with their dragons, harassing local armies that gathered to oppose them. By striking swiftly and unpredictably, they prevented any unified defense from forming. Aegon sent emissaries to the Storm King, the King in the Reach, the King in the Rock, the King in the North, and all the other claimants to royalty. He demanded they renounce their crowns and swear fealty to House Targaryen. Some responded with scorn, others with cautious entreaties for negotiation. The first major test came when the combined might of the Stormlands and the Reach threatened to halt the Targaryen advance near the Wendwater. Tens of thousands of men marched with pikes, swords, and siege engines. They positioned themselves in open fields, expecting to face a conventional battle. But when the Targaryen host arrived, led by Aegon on Balerion, the lines of men grew restless. Flaming projectiles launched toward the sky, but the dragons outmaneuvered them. Soon, columns of fire rained down on the trapped soldiers. The casualties were staggering. In less than a day, the allied forces broke. Many lords surrendered on the spot, Others fled. Aegon accepted oaths of fealty from those who bent the knee, while Visenya and Rhaenys carried out the grim task of punishing those who would not. In this manner, the Targaryens established a foothold in the Crownlands, as they would later be called. Castles capitulated one after another, lacking any effective defense against dragonfire. The greatest threat lay in the houses that controlled the western and northern regions, places far from Dragonstone's immediate reach. Yet success bred further success, for each new vassal provided troops and resources to the Targaryen cause, swelling their ranks. While all of this unfolded, Valyria looked on with mild interest. A few dispatches came from the freehold's ruling councils, congratulating Aegon on expanding Valyrian influence into Westeros. Some families quietly grumbled that the Targaryens were winning glory for themselves rather than for the Empire, but as long as trade and tribute flowed back, the city had no pressing reason to intervene. Aegon's conquests were not perceived as a threat to Valyria. If anything, they were seen as an asset. Then came the critical moment that shifted everything. The Field of Fire. Ambushed by a coalition of the King of the Reach and the King of the Rock, the Targaryen forces found themselves outnumbered by a vast army. This was the largest host Westeros had mustered in living memory. Some said it rivaled the armies Valyria used in the east. Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys soared overhead, each on their respective dragons, unleashing torrents of flame that set the dry grasses ablaze. The inferno consumed thousands of men in mere moments, a horror unparalleled in the annals of Westerosi warfare. When the smoke cleared, the coalition was shattered. The King of the Reach and the King of the Rock knelt and offered their swords. News of this cataclysmic event traveled across Westeros with lightning speed. One by one, the petty kings realized that standing alone or even in alliances was folly against Dragonfire. The Storm King bent the knee. The veil sealed itself behind the bloody gate, though rumors suggested they, too, might soon yield rather than risk immolation. The North remained a question mark. Lord Torrhen Stark, styled King in the North, marched south with an impressive army, hoping to gauge whether the rumors of dragons were exaggerated. When he beheld the devastation wrought at the Field of Fire, however, he chose to kneel rather than sacrifice his people. Thus, in a matter of a few short years, Aegon had accomplished what no Westerosi king had managed. He united the Seven Kingdoms, minus the unconquered Dorne for the time being, under a single ruler. He took the old Targaryen sigil as his new royal banner, proclaiming himself Aegon of House Targaryen, first of his name, King of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm. Visenya crowned him with a Valyrian steel circlet, and the lords who had yielded to him acknowledged him as their sovereign. All of this transpired without the destruction of Valyria. Indeed, the freehold still stood across the sea, presumably content that one of their own had expanded into Westeros. Yet now a question of loyalty arose. Would the new king of Westeros remain a vassal to the Valyrian freehold, or would he claim true independence? The city across the waves might not look kindly on a domain as vast as Westeros operating outside the freehold's direct control. For the time being, Aegon played a delicate game, sending tribute ships to Valyria, acknowledging the freehold's suzerainty in name, but effectively ruling Westeros as he saw fit. And what of Dorne? In this timeline, as in the known one, Dorne proved elusive. When Aegon's forces approached the deserts and mountains of the southern peninsula, they found no standing army to fight, only empty strongholds. The Dornish lords and ladies refused open conflict, disappearing into hidden holds or simply vanishing. Eventually, Rhaenys attempted to force a submission from Sunspear, only to find it abandoned. Rumor had it that the lords of Dorne were lying low, prepared to use guerrilla tactics should the dragons attempt to subjugate them. Realizing he could lose more men than it was worth in a protracted campaign with no pitched battles to win, Aegon temporarily withdrew, focusing on consolidating control elsewhere. Despite these hurdles, the shape of Westeros was changed forever. Castles once named for petty kings now served as seats of lords who owed direct fealty to Aegon. The Targaryens established a new capital along the Blackwater, where they built a sprawling fortress with a dragon pit to house their beasts. Over time, that settlement would grow into a city, King's Landing, named for the place where Aegon first set foot in Westeros proper. So it came to pass that Aegon Targaryen, who grew up amid the wonders and terrors of Valyria, became king in the west. His sisters Visenya and Rhaenys were his partners in conquest, each forging their own roles in the new kingdom. Visenya remained the martial power, forming the seeds of what would become the Kingsguard and maintaining a strict sense of discipline in the court. Rhaenys embodied diplomacy and charm, bridging gaps between newly sworn lords and smoothing the ruffled feathers that followed the Targaryen takeover. Yet the shadow of Valyria lingered. The Freehold was not known for ignoring any potential threats to its absolute dominion. From time to time, Valyrian envoys arrived at King's Landing, bearing letters sealed with the sigils of powerful old houses. They congratulated Aegon on his successes, requested trade privileges, or asked for assistance in pacifying distant corners of Essos. They seldom demanded anything outright, for they suspected, correctly, that the Targaryens were no longer mere lesser vassals. They had proven themselves, and Valyrian, still the mightiest living dragon, remained at Aegon's command. Moreover, the Targaryens had introduced a subtle shift in the balance of power in the Freehold. Other ambitious families saw an opportunity. If Aegon could carve out a kingdom for himself across the sea, why couldn't they claim new territories in Sithorios, the Jade Sea, or beyond? As a result, Valyria's imperial machine revved up, sending out new expeditions and forging further alliances. Some families became rich beyond measure, while others overextended themselves in far-flung campaigns, losing wealth and men in fruitless endeavors. Amid this evolving landscape, Aegon tried to maintain a careful equilibrium. He had realized that Westeros was not a mere stepping stone to greater power within Valyria. No, it was its own realm, with its own histories, peoples, and boundless potential. He, Visenya, and Rhaenys were forging something new, an empire of the West that might one day rival Valyria itself, though Aegon took pains to never publicly declare such an ambition. He invited maesters from the citadel of Old Town to help govern, bridging the gap between the local customs and the knowledge gleaned from Valyria. Under the Targaryen crown, roads were improved, trade flourished, and a new sense of unity began to take root in the hearts of Westerosi lords, albeit grudgingly for some. The question of succession also arose. To solidify the Targaryen claim, Aegon ultimately married both his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, in the Valyrian custom. The Westerosi lords were scandalized at first, but none dared openly challenge the king over matters of marriage. This union produced heirs who inherited the blood of the dragon from both parents, ensuring the line of Targaryen dragon riders would continue. Even so, the presence of multiple heirs sowed the seeds of future quarrels, a reality that all great dynasties face. As the realm stabilized, whispers circulated about whether Aegon might someday bring the might of Westeros to bear against the Freehold, or vice versa. For the time being, though, both sides benefited from peace. Valyria had a friendly, if not fully subservient, ruler in the west, and Aegon had the breathing room to cement his hold on the Seven Kingdoms. A tenuous balance existed between the two Dragonlord powers, separated by the expanse of the narrow sea. Occasionally, Aegon felt a twinge of longing for the city that had shaped him. He recalled the basalt roads, the shining spires, the columns of the Temple of Flame. He remembered the swirl of arcane energies in the air and the smell of smoke rising from the dragon pens. But when he looked around at the bustling growth of King's Landing, its timber frames rising under the direction of Valyrian and Westerosi builders, he felt a new pride. This was his city. These were his people, or would be once they fully accepted his rule. Conflict was far from over. Rebellions flared up occasionally, especially from lords who resented Targaryen authority or thought they could strike when the king was occupied elsewhere. But each revolt was swiftly answered by dragon riders, leaving scorched earth and fear in their wake. Over time, the memory of dragonfire became an unspoken deterrent. The lords realized that if they abided by Aegon's laws, they were allowed significant autonomy in governing their own lands. Only a fool invited the wrath of the Black Dread. Yet one region continued to resist, Dorne. Rhaenys tried to handle them diplomatically, riding Vaelith across the mountains to negotiate with Dornish nobles. She appealed to their sense of self-preservation, suggesting that alignment with the Targaryens would bring new trade routes and mutual defense. But the Dornish were proud and fierce, unwilling to bow to a foreign king. When cornered, they melted away into the deserts, ambushing Targaryen outriders with cunning tactics. Over the years, an endless stalemate unfolded, with neither side managing a decisive blow. Aegon found it tiresome but decided that the cost of subjugating Dorne might be higher than it was worth, especially given that the rest of Westeros was now under his command. Occasionally, an emissary from Valyria would inquire about Dorne, subtly chiding Aegon for failing to bring the entire continent to heel. He would smile and say, "In due time." They would sip wine, talk of other matters, and then part ways. Behind that smile, Aegon weighed the calculus of risking more men, more resources, and another potential uprising in areas that had finally settled into relative peace. Perhaps, if the day came that Valyria questioned his independence too sharply, he might attempt a final conquest of Dorne to prove his might. But for now, the stalemate continued. Years passed. The new realm of Westeros took shape. King's Landing expanded rapidly, a city teeming with trade from Essos and the Westerland's gold. Roads were built, facilitating travel from the Crownlands to the Stormlands, the Reach, and the Westerlands. Aegon fostered a policy encouraging the settlement of new towns along the Blackwater River, awarding charters to merchants who brought in foreign goods. Soon, markets were brimming with silk from Lys, spices from the Summer Islands, and dwarfish crafts from the east. Rhaenys, ever the diplomat, built a network of friendships among the great lords. She traveled far and wide, sometimes with Vaelith, other times on horseback to show that she did not always need a dragon to display her authority. She created a sense of approachability that tempered the fear many felt toward the Targaryens. Visenya, on the other hand, formed the nucleus of a new royal guard, an elite cadre of warriors sworn to serve the king and his line absolutely. Called the King's Guard, these sworn knights wore pure white cloaks and answered only to the crown. Visenya personally selected them, forging them into an institution that would outlive their generation. Aegon presided over the royal court, establishing laws that might unify the realm. Many of these laws took inspiration from Valyrian practices, particularly regarding centralized authority, while still adapting to Westerosi traditions of knighthood, lordly rights, and the feudal system. The faith of the Seven, widely practiced in the south, sometimes chafed at Targaryen rule, especially given the incestuous marriage arrangement. But Aegon worked to maintain peace with the High Septon, granting the faith wide latitude to continue its spiritual guidance, so long as it did not openly oppose the crown. Meanwhile, across the sea, Valyria continued to flourish. The rumored doom, that cataclysm that in another timeline would have shattered the peninsula, never arrived. The old city glowed with sorcery and wealth, forging new wonders and forging new atrocities alike. Sometimes enslaved peoples from distant lands rebelled, but the city put them down with dragonfire. The empire remained a beacon of power and terror to all who encountered it. In subtle ways, though, Aegon sensed that Valyria's unchallenged supremacy might wane. The older houses were fractious. Each competed for resources and prestige, sometimes sabotaging each other's endeavors. With no external threat capable of matching Valyrian dragons, the empire found itself rotting from within. Corruption, petty rivalries, and an unending appetite for expansion created cracks in the foundation of the freehold. Aegon wondered if, one day, those cracks might widen enough to swallow the city in a different sort of doom, a slow decay rather than a sudden cataclysm. Yet that was not his fight, nor did he wish it to be. Westeros was his realm now. In the privacy of his chambers, he would sometimes think back on the boy he was, wandering the corridors of the Targaryen manse in Valyria, gazing at the blazing skies and dreaming of claiming the mightiest dragon. The dream had come true, albeit in a way he could never have imagined. He had left the city of his birth behind, forging a new destiny for himself, his sisters, and their line. As he gazed out from the highest tower of the Red Keep, as the newly built fortress in King's Landing was called, Aegon beheld a realm at peace, for the moment. The city below bustled with life, The sails of ships crowded the harbor, and the Targaryen banners fluttered proudly over the walls. To the west lay fertile plains. To the north, snow-capped mountains and icy wilderness. To the south, deserts and unbowed Dornish lords. And across the sea, the ancient might of Valyria, once his home. He found himself torn between love and caution toward that distant empire. If Valyria ever decided it wanted more direct control over Westeros, war between dragonlords might erupt, an event that could devastate entire continents. But as the years rolled on, it seemed the Freehold's internal rivalries kept it too busy to unify an effort to bring Westeros to heel. They seemed content to let the Targaryens rule, so long as trade and tribute flowed. For his part, Aegon had no desire to burn the Freehold. He owed them his heritage, and the city itself was a wonder. Sometimes he half expected that in old age, he might return there, bridging the gap between the two great centers of dragon power and forging a deeper peace. But if that day ever came, it would be long in the future, when the lines of succession in Westeros were secure, when his children or grandchildren ruled without question. In the final analysis, the world was richer, more complex, and arguably more stable with Valyria intact and Westeros united under Targaryen rule. That did not mean the future was free of conflict. Far from it. Ambition, fear, and power still circled each other like caged dragons. The older families in Valyria might yet see the Targaryens as upstarts who needed to be brought back into the fold. The lords of Westeros might chafe under a foreign-born king, especially as memories of the Field of Fire faded. New lands, new opportunities, new rivalries, these were guaranteed. But for the moment, standing at the apex of his newly built kingdom, Aegon Targaryen allowed himself a measure of quiet satisfaction. He had proven that the might of Valyria need not remain chained to the old ways of endless exploitation and cruelty. He ruled with justice, at least the kind of justice he believed in, and he had begun to temper the worst excesses of conquest. He was not naive enough to think he could change everything overnight, nor that the line of Targaryen kings would remain benevolent forever. Yet the seeds of a different sort of rule had been planted. And so, beneath the crimson rays of a setting sun, Aegon reached out his hand. Valyrian soared in the distance, a black silhouette against the burning sky. The beat of those massive wings echoed in Aegon's heart, a reminder of the bond that had set him apart from the start. He had once been a quiet boy in Valyria, overshadowed by more powerful houses, overshadowed even by the might of Balerion himself. Now he was king of Westeros, a conqueror in his own right, forging a new realm that might one day rival the Freehold. Perhaps that was always his destiny, that the black flames he commanded were not meant to consume him but to light his path. He was Aegon Targaryen, Dragonlord, king, conqueror, and scion of an unbroken Valyria. He stood astride the narrow sea, one foot planted in the ancient empire, the other in a kingdom he had carved from the chaos of Westeros. Though 1,000 perils lay behind him and 1,000 more before him, he did not waver. The future, bright with dragonfire, spread out across the horizon, waiting to be shaped by his will. Perhaps, in time, the land he ruled would be known not just for war, but for the melding of two great cultures, Valyrian sorcery and Westerosi tradition. Perhaps the new generation, raised with the knowledge of dragons and the memory of burning fields, would seek peace more fervently than their ancestors. Or perhaps the cycle of ambition and vengeance would repeat, as it so often did in both Valyria and Westeros. In any case, Aegon's name was now etched into history, destined to be recalled by bards and maesters for centuries to come. If the old gods of Valyria truly existed, perhaps they watched this development with interest, content that the blood of the dragon had found new soil to conquer. If the seven heavens of the Westerosi faith were real, perhaps they, too, took note of the silver-haired king who straddled both worlds. What was certain is that Aegon had opened a door that could never be closed again. Far away, the city of Valyria still shone under its mosaic of arcane lights, unthreatened by any doom. In another timeline, it would have died in screaming fire and ash, leaving only scattered survivors. But in this world, it lived on, an aging titan that continued to shape the destinies of countless peoples. Aegon was no longer one of the powerless thousands who scurried under its spires. He was a king in his own right, forging a legacy that might one day stand equal to the empire that birthed him. For now, he would watch over his 7 kingdoms, unified but fragile, bound together by the memory of Dragonfire and the oath of fealty each lord had sworn. He would see them grow, see them prosper, see them become something greater than a mere extension of Valyrian dominion. He vowed to himself that he would rule justly, forging a path that diverged from the worst excesses of the freehold. And should any challenge come, from rebellious lords, from Dornish resistance, or even from the distant might of Valyria, he stood ready to meet it, flanked by his sisters, guarded by the fiercest dragons in the world. Thus began the reign of Aegon the Conqueror in a realm untouched by the doom of Valyria. No cataclysm had driven him from his homeland. No apocalyptic fate had whittled the Targaryens down to a desperate few. Instead, he carried the strength and knowledge of a living Valyria within him. Armed with the greatest of dragons, guided by his own sense of honor and ambition, he shaped Westeros into a united kingdom, one that balanced on the precipice of greatness and potential ruin, as all empires do. In time, the chronicles would record this era with awe. Some would say Aegon was a visionary who brought peace and stability to a fractured land. Others would curse him as a foreign tyrant who imposed his will with fire and blood. But no one could deny that the world had changed. The flight of 3 dragons from Valyria to Dragonstone had turned the tide of history. A new order had risen, its foundations built on the legacy of the greatest empire that ever was, yet destined to follow its own path. Aegon's nights were often filled with dreams. He dreamt of black skies and swirling embers, of dragons locked in battle, of 1,000 swords hammered into a throne. He dreamt of children with silver hair, eyes shining with violet fire, carrying on his name long after he was gone. He dreamt of a land that might one day see more than the threat of burning fields, perhaps a land that harnessed the awe of dragons for progress, not just conquest. And yes, he dreamt of what would happen if Valyria ever fell prey to its own internal storms. Would Westeros become the refuge for those who might flee? Or would it rise as the new center of draconic might, overshadowing the old? Such questions had no easy answers. But Aegon was at peace with them, for he was no mere warlord. He was a king, and kings rarely have the luxury of certainty. Day by day, he guided his realm, forging new laws, settling disputes, and ensuring that the lords who had sworn fealty did not forget their oaths. At times, he privately mourned the cruelty inherent in maintaining rule by Dragonfire, but he also knew that without that power, the realm would fragment. Eventually, he told himself, the threat of flame would not need to be used so often, once unity and prosperity took firmer root. The people of Westeros, for their part, gradually adjusted to their new reality. Some saw opportunity under Targaryen rule, a chance to trade, to gain favor at court, or to settle old grudges by appealing to the crown's justice. Others resisted, forming secret pockets of rebellion that the Targaryen dragons would periodically sniff out and destroy. Bitterness lingered in pockets of the Stormlands, the Reach and the Vale, but open defiance was rare. The fear of total annihilation by Dragonfire outweighed the hope of victory. In this measured way, King Aegon I Targaryen solidified his realm, always with one eye turned eastward, toward the homeland that still thrived. When word arrived that certain rival houses in Valyria had come to blows over territory in Sithorios, Aegon simply listened. It did not concern him directly, not unless Valyria tried to demand Westerosi troops or resources. And if they did, he would have to decide if Westeros would stand as a subject to the freehold, or if this new kingdom would assert its independence. That was a battle for another day. And so the seasons turned, and the 7 kingdoms under House Targaryen became more than a novelty on the far side of the sea. It became a realm of note, with its own dignity and might, recognized by passing merchants and distant rulers who heard tales of a new Valyrian king in the west. Some even speculated that, in time, Westeros might overshadow the old empire if Valyria continued to tear itself apart with internal rivalries. But that was speculation best whispered in taverns or behind closed doors, for the freehold did not look kindly on talk of its decline. In the latter years of Aegon's reign, he found himself pondering the question of whether he had done enough to curb the worst excesses of conquest. The people of Westeros lived under his reign, but they also lived under the looming presence of dragons. Did they truly accept him, or did they simply fear him? Was that distinction even relevant to a Valyrian king? He was no moral philosopher, yet these thoughts nagged at him in quieter moments, especially when Rhaenys tried to speak of the future. She wanted to see a realm bound by loyalty, not fear, though she understood that fear was the bedrock of loyalty in the Valyrian tradition. Visenya, for her part, believed that so long as they held the ultimate power, it did not matter. They could shape the realm as they pleased. Aegon balanced these opposing views. He introduced reforms that might improve the lives of common folk, knowing that a happier populace would be less inclined to rebellion. He encouraged the faith of the Seven to hold services in King's Landing and other major towns, though he insisted that the crown remained supreme in matters of state. He welcomed travelers from Essos, including some from Valyria, who marveled at the rising power of this western kingdom. Still, in the heart of the Red Keep, it was the same silver-haired, violet-eyed family who held all the cards Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys, along with the heirs they would produce. Those heirs grew up in a Westeros where the Valyrian language was spoken in court alongside the common tongue, where dragons nested in the hills behind the city, and where the memory of conquest was still fresh. They did not know the labyrinthine spires of the original freehold, but they carried its legacy in their veins. And thus, without the doom Valyria endured, and Aegon Targaryen brought a piece of it to Westeros. In forging a new empire, he changed the shape of two continents, linking them by trade, by blood, and by the primal force of dragons. No cataclysm had wiped the slate clean, forcing the Targaryens to rise from the ashes as the sole survivors of a dead civilization. Instead, they soared on the wings of a living behemoth, with the possibility of future collisions, political or military, between King's Landing and Valyria always simmering on the horizon. For now, though, the realm was at peace, or as near to peace as lands governed by swords and dragons could be. Aegon stood at the pinnacle of power, a conqueror who had realized the dream of unifying a continent, forging a dynasty that might last for centuries. Though the shadows of a distant empire loomed behind him, he would not falter. Valyria might claim him as one of its own, but the Seven Kingdoms claimed him as their king. He straddled both worlds, forging a third path in the crucible of history. So ended the earliest chapter of Aegon Targaryen's reign, an era defined by ambition, conquest, and uneasy peace. In the nights to come, he would still dream of Valyria, its flame-lit skies, its chanting sorcerers, its unstoppable legions of dragons. He would wonder if, one day, the freehold might bring its full weight to bear on Westeros, demanding fealty or offering a new alliance that could reshape the entire world. Until that day, he would continue building his own kingdom, forging laws, punishing rebellion, rewarding loyalty, and ensuring that the Targaryen name became synonymous not just with conquest, but with enduring rule. In this world without the doom, the story of Aegon the Conqueror was but one thread in the vast tapestry of Valyria's ongoing saga. Yet it was a thread that might, in time, overshadow all others. For as many in Valyria itself would admit, Valyrian the Black Dread had chosen a new domain, and that domain was no mere province. It was the wide, sprawling continent of Westeros, a kingdom now loyal to House Targaryen, a realm that recognized only one king. A king who, in the end, was still the boy from Valyria, now writ large across the pages of history, an emperor in all but name, forging a new destiny far from the labyrinthine shadows of his homeland. And though no cataclysmic doom had swept Valyria away, fate has a habit of unraveling even the grandest of tapestries. Future generations would look upon Aegon's conquests and wonder if a cataclysm of another kind might one day befall the freehold, internal strife, betrayal, or an overreach of power. Others speculated that perhaps Valyria was eternal, that no mortal force could bring it to ruin. No one knew, and Aegon himself did not dwell on such possibilities for long. He had a kingdom to rule, siblings to stand beside him, and dragons to remind the world that fire and blood still shaped the course of nations. All that mattered was the realm he had seized, the seat he had built, and the legacy he would leave behind. For better or for worse, the Seven Kingdoms would never be the same, and neither would Valyria. A new power had arisen in the west, crowned with black steel, riding the greatest of dragons, and carrying forward a lineage that was supposed to bow to none. In the end, that was Aegon's truth, that he was both Valyrian and something more, something new, an embodiment of the past, present, and future, all borne aloft by the beating wings of destiny. Aegon rose before the sun, emerging onto the highest balcony of the Red Keep while King's Landing still slept below. His breath plumed faintly in the pre-dawn chill, and the sky was a wide vault of deep blue touched with the first hints of orange at the horizon. In the distance, he could just make out the shapes of merchant vessels in the Blackwater Bay, sails furled against the night wind, waiting for dawn to guide them upriver. Behind him, the Red Keep's newly finished stone walls towered in austere lines, their mortar still smelling of fresh construction. He gazed inland. The city beneath him stretched out in cramped clusters, half-finished neighborhoods of wood and daub, dotted with stone towers erected by the wealthier new arrivals. Traders had come from all over Westeros, and from some corners of Essos too, eager to make their fortunes in the fledgling royal capital. Torches along the main thoroughfares glowed faintly, revealing wagons and weary travelers camped near the gates, waiting for morning to resume their journeys. The city's silhouette was both chaotic and pregnant with promise, a testament to the speed with which it had grown. Aegon's eyes shifted south and east, where the horizon melted into watery haze. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay Valyria, the cradle of his people. Still hale, still grand, still forging its own fate. A day would come, he knew, when his ties to that ancient freehold would be tested once again. But for the moment, his concerns lay here, upon the soil of Westeros. The Seven Kingdoms had knelt to him, most of them anyway, and he would not forsake the responsibility he had claimed. He turned at the sound of footsteps. Visenya approached, clad in a dark, close-fitting tunic. Her hair, a silver braid coiled at the crown of her head, reflected the torchlight. Her sword, Dark Sister, hung at her hip, as always. She regarded Aegon with a measured expression before stepping to stand beside him. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, though it was more a statement than a question. Aegon shook his head. "The realm sleeps uneasily. At times, so do I." Visenya's gaze swept out over the city. "You've built this from almost nothing. I think you can rest easier than most kings who have tried to hold these lands." He let out a soft exhale. "We did it together." She nodded. A moment passed, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Then her voice carried a slight edge. "Rhaenys returned late last night, you know. Flew in from the Reach. Reports trouble. Some malcontent lords still trying to stir up discontent in the southwestern marches." Aegon wasn't surprised. There had been stirrings of trouble ever since he had bested the king of the Reach at the Field of Fire. Although Mern Gardner had died in that conflagration, the new rulers of Highgarden, House Tyrell elevated by Aegon, were not yet universally loved by their bannermen. Some older families, proud in their lineage, chafed at the abrupt shift in power. "I'll speak with Rhaenys. We can decide what show of force might be necessary," Aegon said. "No sense letting a minor rebellion fester." Visenya's lips curved into something like a predatory smile. "Valyrians and I will be ready." He almost teased her for her relish in deploying Dragonfire, but he refrained. He understood her nature. She was a warrior born, formidable and stoic, and the mere threat of her presence often settled disputes. If lords in the Reach wished to test the crown, they would soon learn what it meant to face a Targaryen queen astride a dragon. Turning from the balcony, Aegon made his way inside, down corridors lined with newly hung tapestries depicting the conquest. The largest tapestry of all showed the Field of Fire in chilling detail. 3 dragons raining flame upon countless men, the ground streaked with molten gold from melted armor. Small wonder some courtiers insisted the new capital needed gentler artwork to inspire loyalty rather than dread. But Aegon believed in reminding the realm of what had brought them to heel. Fear was not the only instrument of rule, but it remained a potent one. He reached the war room, a high-ceiling chamber dominated by a large table that displayed a rough map of Westeros. Candles flickered around its edges. Rhaenys was already there, warming her hands at a small brazier. She turned when he entered, a smile tugging at her lips. "I hoped you'd come," she said. "I've just finished speaking with the riders who accompanied me." Aegon approached the table. "What news from the Reach specifically?" "They're calling themselves the Band of the Horn," Rhaenys said. "Some young knight from a cadet branch of House Peak seems to have declared himself a champion of true undull tradition, whatever that means. He's rallied a few malcontents who resent House Tyrell's rise. They've attacked a few supply convoys heading south from Highgarden. It's more annoyance than real danger for now, but if it's left unchecked, it could grow." Aegon frowned. "Could the Tyrells handle it themselves?" "They might," Rhaenys said, "but it would be a slow process. The Band of the Horn hides in the foothills of the Red Mountains, striking then melting away. If we want a swift end, we should intervene. Show them that rebellion won't be tolerated." Visenya entered behind him, arms folded. "I'll take Valyrians and see how they like a taste of Dragonfire. They won't hide so easily with half the forest on fire." Rhaenys cast her older sister an admonishing look. "We can't simply burn the countryside every time a few troublemakers appear, Visenya. That only creates new grievances." "Fewer bandits alive to have grievances," Visenya retorted. Aegon weighed their perspectives. Rhaenys was right about the danger of turning every problem into a smoldering ruin, especially in a land that was still adjusting to Targaryen rule. But Visenya had a point. If the crown appeared hesitant or unwilling to use its greatest advantage, more rebellions might crop up. "Let's try a measured approach," he said at length. "We send a detachment under a trusted commander to deal with these bandits. Visenya, you'll fly overhead, but you won't unleash Valyria's flames unless it becomes necessary. A show of force might be enough to scatter them." Visenya inclined her head, accepting the compromise. Rhaenys offered a small smile, her relief evident. "I'll remain in King's Landing, then, to address those merchant delegations from Pentos and Tyrosh." "You have the best knack for diplomacy," Aegon said. "I'd be lost without you handling the trade tongues." That drew a genuine laugh from Rhaenys. "Speak truly, brother. You simply hate sitting through the endless calculations of taxes and port fees." Aegon smiled. "That too." They planned the expedition swiftly. Word would be dispatched to Highgarden so the Tyrells would know to expect royal support. Within a day or two, Visenya and a company of mounted knights would ride out, with Valyrians flying above. That done, they each set to their daily tasks. Aegon's was no small burden. Hearing petitions in the throne room, mediating disputes among lords, and preparing for the arrival of certain envoys from Valyria. Rumor had it these envoys carried proposals for a new trade agreement, one that might further bind Westeros into Valyria's sphere. Aegon did not relish the idea of being beholden to the freehold, but neither did he wish to provoke them by refusing all cooperation. He walked the blade's edge, maintaining courtesy while guarding his realm's sovereignty. His throne room was still a work in progress, though the Iron Throne itself was nearly finished. Hundreds, if not thousands, of captured swords from the conquered kings had been hammered, twisted, and fused by dragonfire into a hulking seat of dark metal. Aegon sometimes wondered if the throne's jagged edges were an apt reflection of the kingdom he ruled, sharp, unyielding, and precarious. Men and women of all stations filtered through that grand space. Foreign merchants with colorful silks sought charters. Lords from the Westerlands petitioned for lesser seats in the new crown administration. Hedge knights hoped for royal favor. Aegon heard them all, though he found little joy in the mundane details. He delegated what he could to his newly formed council men and a few women he trusted. Overseeing all was himself, the Dragon King, who could not afford to appear indifferent. He was midway through hearing a trifling dispute between two minor landed knights, something about a boundary marker on farmland near the Windwater, when he heard commotion near the rear of the hall. The great oaken doors creaked open, and a herald announced the unexpected arrival of envoys from Valyria. Aegon signaled for the knights to step aside. The entire throne room seemed to tense as a small party advanced. 3 men in robes of shimmering silver and gold, their hair the pale platinum of Valyrian nobility, accompanied by a retinue of slaves in drab gray livery. The lead envoy was tall and regal, with the haughty bearing so characteristic of Valyrian dragonlords. His eyes, pale violet, swept the throne room with careful calculation. "Welcome to King's Landing," Aegon said from atop the Iron Throne, projecting calm authority. The envoy inclined his head, a courteous bow that nonetheless fell just shy of genuine deference. "King Aegon Targaryen, I am Reinder Maegor, come on behalf of the Archie's coalition in Valyria." The name pricked Aegon's memory. The Archie's coalition was a faction among the older houses, a group that favored more aggressive expansions. He had not expected them to send an envoy so soon. "You've traveled far, Lord Maegor. I trust your journey was without incident." Reinder offered a thin smile. "Our ships were well provisioned, thanks to your father's kin in the old city. The sea was kind." He gestured to his attendants, who stepped forward with a small chest. "We bring tokens of goodwill, works of Valyrian steel, enchanted glass from the peninsula's southern forges, and a fragment of fused stone to remind you of your ancestral roots." At once, the crowd in the throne room leaned forward, curious. Even Aegon felt a pang. Fused stone was an ancient Valyrian craft, rarely shared with outsiders. He motioned for his steward to accept the gifts. "Thank you. We are grateful. May I ask what business brings the Archie's coalition to Westeros?" Reinder's eyes flicked to the onlookers and back to Aegon. "Perhaps some matters are best discussed in private, Your Grace." Aegon understood. He dismissed the court for the day, ordering the lesser petitions postponed. The Valyrian envoys were ushered into a smaller council chamber, where Rhaenys joined them. The queens, especially Rhaenys, took seats at Aegon's side, while knights of the Kingsguard stood watch. Servants brought wine and sweetmeats, then withdrew, leaving them to parley. Reinder Maegor set aside his formal airs once the doors closed. "King Aegon, it gladdens me to see your success in Westeros. The Targaryen name is spoken with respect in Valyria these days, especially after your achievements." Aegon kept his tone neutral. "I'm pleased to hear that." Reinder inclined his head. "The Archie's coalition believes that, with your realm secure, it might be time to discuss how Westeros can serve the Freehold's broader aims. We have heard rumor of rich gold mines in the Westerlands, pearls off the coasts of the north, and other resources yet untapped. The Freehold wonders if you might be willing to share access, perhaps even allow a Valyrian presence to oversee extraction for mutual profit." He paused, letting the proposal land. Aegon sensed Rhaenys stiffen beside him. A Valyrian presence in the Westerlands could easily become a foothold for direct interference in Westerosi affairs. Visenya would likely have bristled outright if she were here, but she was still preparing for the expedition to the Reach. Before Aegon could answer, Reinder continued. "In return, the Archie's coalition is prepared to offer you official recognition as a prince of the Freehold, an exalted rank. Your seat in Valyria's councils would be assured. And of course, we would share certain arcane secrets that might benefit your new capital. Some families in Valyria, I need not remind you, command magics that can transform entire landscapes." Rhaenys spoke softly but firmly. "It is generous of the coalition to consider us for such favors. Yet we must be cautious. The lords of Westeros entrusted their lands to King Aegon, not to be governed or exploited by foreign houses." Reinder nodded, though his expression betrayed frustration. "Of course, we understand. But consider the might of our collaboration. With your dragons and your rightful dominion here, plus Valyria's endless resources and knowledge, we might raise Westeros to new heights, cities of fused stone, wonders that rival the oldest enclaves in Essos. Surely you do not mean to keep this land in its present, shall we say, rustic state?" Aegon steepled his fingers. He recalled his own youth in Valyria, the gleaming spires, the arcane might on every corner. Part of him still felt awe at the thought of harnessing such power here. Yet he also recalled the cruelty, the oppression, and the endless feuds that plagued the freehold. Did he truly wish to invite that influence into a kingdom still finding its feet? "I will consider your proposal," Aegon said at last. "But I cannot promise that I'll open the Westerlands to direct oversight from Valyrian houses. My lords have pledged fealty to House Targaryen, not the freehold. Any arrangement must respect their rights and ensure the realm's stability. I will not see Westeros carved into enclaves for every Valyrian faction seeking quick profits." Reinder took a sip of wine, attempting an air of relaxed confidence. "Certainly, we would never dream of undermining your sovereignty." His words were smooth, but Aegon knew how Valyrian politics worked. A wedge driven in just the right place could split his realm's loyalty. If the coalition established a foothold in the Westerlands, gold-hungry Valyrian houses would flood in, and soon the local lords might question whether they were better off under Targaryen rule or direct Valyrian patronage. The last thing Aegon wanted was a realm divided between those loyal to King's Landing and those who saw more advantage in bowing to the ancient families of the freehold. He forced a tight smile. "We appreciate the courtesy of your visit. I propose we meet again in a few days' time, after I have consulted with my council and the lords most directly affected. Then we might explore specific terms." Reinder bowed. "Very well, Your Grace. We look forward to hearing from you." As soon as the envoys withdrew, Rhaenys let out a breath. "They come here, bearing gifts and talk of cooperation, but we both know they see Westeros as a resource to be tapped." Aegon rubbed his temple. "Yes, and if I outright deny them, they might interpret that as hostility. The last thing I need is a reason for Valyria to gather its forces and march dragons across the sea." She nodded, her expression grave. "I suppose it's a question of how much we can accommodate without giving them the keys to our kingdom." "Precisely. We can't isolate ourselves entirely. Trade with Valyria does help our economy. But we must be careful." Rhaenys hesitated. "If the older houses in Valyria truly wanted to dethrone us, they could try. Yet you have Valyrian and they remember what you achieved here. Perhaps that is enough to keep them cautious, at least for a time." Aegon straightened. "I must ensure it stays that way. We'll craft a treaty that grants them some trade privileges but keeps them away from direct governance. Let them have a token presence, warehouses, offices in Lannisport or King's Landing, but no strongholds. No controlling stake in our mines. We maintain final authority in all matters." He paused, glancing at Rhaenys. "Will you assist me with the negotiations? Your skill at forging compromises could prove invaluable." Rhaenys' lips curved into a small, rueful smile. "It seems that is my fate, keeping the peace with old Valyria. Yes, brother, I will." So began a cautious dance. Over the next weeks, Reinder Maegor and his cohort attended sumptuous feasts in the Red Keep, conversing with Westerosi lords. Aegon arranged hunts and tourneys in their honor, displaying the prowess of his knights. The Valyrian envoys, for their part, made themselves pleasant, praising the city's rapid growth and even offering magical trifles. A glowing orb that provided endless torchlight, an enchanted tapestry that played faint music when touched. They hammered out the broad strokes of a trade treaty, ensuring that goods could flow between the Seven Kingdoms and the freehold without prohibitive tariffs. Aegon insisted on strict limitations preventing any Valyrian family from purchasing large tracts of Westerosi land. Reinder agreed, though not without subtle attempts to insert loopholes. Throughout these negotiations, the threat of larger conflict loomed unspoken. Both sides knew that if talks collapsed, war between dragons could follow, a horrifying prospect for both realms. The freehold was massive and ancient, but Westeros had a single, unified authority in Aegon. And Balerian's legend was no small thing in Valyria. Tales of the Black Dread's feats had grown in the telling, making Aegon's bond with him a matter of near-mythic significance. Meanwhile, Visenya had departed with her detachment to crush the Band of the Horn in the Reach. Aegon received word via Raven that she had found their hideouts, burned a few strongholds, but only after giving fair warning, and broken the rebellion. The captured ringleaders had been sent to Highgarden for judgment, ensuring that the Tyrells could demonstrate their authority. Another spark of unrest snuffed out. One evening, After a day's session with Reinder that left Aegon drained, he retreated to his private solar, a small, cozy room with a single window overlooking the courtyard. A brazier glowed in the corner, and the walls were lined with shelves of scrolls detailing everything from local genealogies to transcribed Valyrian histories. Rhaenys joined him, carrying a flagon of spiced wine. She poured 2 cups, handing one to him. "To your health, brother." He took it gratefully, sipping the fragrant brew. "We're making progress, but gods, it's tedious." The Valyrians measure every word, as though searching for any advantage. She sank into a chair. "They are searching for advantage, but so are we." Aegon rubbed the back of his neck. "I suppose so, and once we conclude these treaties, we'll have established a pattern. Valyria will expect ongoing involvement here. That might be the price of peace." She studied him for a moment. "You can still admire some parts of the freehold, can't you? Despite everything." He considered the question. "Yes, in a way. The city was my home. Parts of it. Its grandeur, its scholarship, its mastery of crafts, still fill me with awe. But we both know the dark underside that comes with that power." Rhaenys nodded pensively. "If only we could have one without the other." They shared a quiet moment, remembering childhood days in Valyria's twisting streets. The colonnades, the soaring dragons overhead, felt like a lifetime ago. Now they were here, forging a new realm, uncertain if it would be a mirror of the freehold or something better. Eventually, Aegon stood. "I'll have to write to the lords of the Westerlands. Let them know what's being discussed. They deserve to be informed." Rhaenys gave a small, wry smile. "We're a long way from the simpler days of conquest, aren't we?" He laughed softly. "Yes, sister, we are." She left, and he spent the next hour drafting letters, describing the general shape of the treaty to Lord Lannister and certain other key figures. He explained that no land would be ceded to Valyrian families, but that trade concessions might bring them wealth and opportunities. He sealed the letters with the 3-headed dragon of House Targaryen, then summoned a scribe to copy and dispatch them. The next day brought fresh challenges. A brawl in the city's harbor district had resulted in the death of a Pentoshi merchant, leading that merchant's guild to demand compensation. The city watch had caught a local gang responsible, but the incident threatened to sour relations with Pentos. Aegon assigned men to investigate thoroughly, instructing his justiciars to handle the matter swiftly and fairly. Before midday, a messenger arrived from Dragonstone, carrying news that the castle's castellan had discovered a store of old Valyrian texts hidden in a sealed chamber. Aegon's eyes lit with interest at the mention of newly unearthed knowledge. But he had no time to indulge such scholarly pursuits, not with negotiations at a critical point. So life went on in King's Landing, an endless swirl of governance, negotiations, and the occasional threat of rebellion. Valyrian remained a looming presence, often perched on the rocky outcrop above the city or gliding overhead. Few dared question the king's authority when that monstrous silhouette grazed the sun. Still, Aegon found that ruling by fear alone was too draining. He wanted to build something lasting, not just an empire of ashes. At last, the day arrived for the formal signing of the trade treaty with Reinder Maegor. The Iron Throne loomed behind Aegon as he stood in full regalia, black and red attire, a simple crown of Valyrian steel upon his silver hair. Rhaenys was at his side. The Valyrian envoys, similarly dressed in fine robes, approached with solemnity. The new High Septon, present as an observer, offered a cautious blessing, for the faith of the Seven still viewed these foreign dealings with suspicion, but recognized the king's right to make them. A quill made of dragonbone was dipped into ink. Aegon signed first, then Reinder. Applause rippled through the hall, more of relief than celebration. A new milestone. Westeros was now officially open to certain Valyrian traders, while retaining a level of autonomy that had not existed under the old arrangement of half-ignored outposts. In return, the Targaryens accepted symbolic membership in the Freehold's councils, though in practice it meant Aegon would be invited to send representatives to Valyria, not that he must obey its every edict. "May our realms prosper together," Reinder said, smiling for the gathered lords and courtiers. "May it be so," Aegon replied, keeping his expression composed. When the ceremony ended, an uneasy sense of accomplishment filled the Red Keep. Most lords recognized that trading with Valyria could bring great wealth, assuming the city did not attempt further encroachment. For his part, Aegon doubted this would be the last test of wills. The freehold never lacked for ambition. He imagined other factions might arrive, each seeking privileges or alliances. Still, for the moment, the tension abated. The Valyrian envoys made plans to return home, carrying word of the treaty's success. Reinder lingered in King's Landing a few extra days, partaking in feasts and tournaments. On the last night before his departure, he confided to Aegon that certain powerful families in Valyria were less than enthusiastic about the arrangement. Some resented the Targaryens' independent streak and wanted a more direct form of vassalage. But for now, Reinder said, the coalition had enough influence to prevail. "See that they keep it," Aegon replied. "I have no wish to see our peoples at war." Reinder simply gave a knowing nod. "Nor do I, King Aegon. But in Valyria, sometimes war is a matter of pride." With that, he left. In the months that followed, King's Landing continued to grow. Valyrian ships became a common sight in the harbor, their sails emblazoned with various house sigils. Westerosi gold changed hands for silks, glass, precious stones, and exotic animals. A few small enclaves of Valyrian merchants formed in the city, each abiding by the crown's laws, but the watchful eyes of Targaryen-appointed officials made sure they did not exceed their granted privileges. Every so often, a new rumor of trouble emerged. A group of Westerosi lords complaining about foreigners, or a Valyrian merchant caught trying to bribe city watchmen. But Aegon's administration, bolstered by the best of both Westerosi feudal traditions and Valyrian bureaucratic savvy, managed to keep such incidents contained. Meanwhile, the realm slowly knitted itself together. The Lannisters oversaw a surge in mine productivity, paying a healthy tax to the crown. The Tyrells busily promoted farmland expansion in the Reach, forging trade links to King's Landing that supplied the city with food. The Baratheons in the Stormlands rebuilt battered roads and fortresses. House Arryn in the Vale maintained cautious neutrality, but at least they were no longer openly defiant. The North remained stoic and distant, ruled by Torrhen Stark as Lord of Winterfell, content to handle its own affairs so long as the king demanded no undue interference. Dorne, ever the Thorn, continued its strategy of non-engagement. The Martells and Sunspear sent only a trickle of correspondence, largely ignoring the Targaryen presence. Aegon decided to let them be for the time being, seeing no benefit in a protracted desert war. Perhaps the day would come when a more diplomatic approach succeeded, or when the crown's might grew so overwhelming that even Dorne could not resist. Within King's Landing, Rhaenys oversaw the construction of new districts, ensuring that roads connected the harbor to the upper city. She personally championed the building of a grand amphitheater for public events and performances, hoping to cultivate a cultural identity for the capital that went beyond martial displays. Visenya, upon returning from her expedition in the Reach, focused on reorganizing the city watch, training them to a standard higher than that of mere thugs with cudgels. The result was a more disciplined force, though it remained a work in progress. Some days, Aegon felt more like a steward than a king, juggling the endless details. He often found solace at dusk, when he would walk alone on the castle battlements or fly briefly on Balerion, circling high above the city. From that vantage, the sprawl of King's Landing looked almost orderly, the patchwork of rooftops forming a living tapestry. Farther out, farmland and forests rolled away, dotted with villages that recognized his rule. One such evening, as he circled above the waters of Blackwater Bay, Balerion gave a low rumble of discontent, twisting his massive head to look north. Aegon peered in that direction, seeing nothing but open sea. Then, to the south, he caught a glimpse of a Valyrian ship, its pale sails reflecting the twilight. The sight filled him with a mixture of pride and unease. Valyria was now an everyday reality here, not just a distant memory. He guided Balerion to a landing spot just outside the Red Keep, the ground trembling under the dragon's weight. Grooms rushed forward to tend the beast, offering sheep and cattle for the night's feeding. Aegon dismounted, gazing at the scale and muscle of the black dread as the creature bent down to devour its meal. With a final glance, he headed inside, heart brimming with conflicting emotions. He reminded himself that everything he did, every deal, every compromise, every show of strength, was for the realm he had forged. Without the doom, Valyria remained a lurking colossus, and his best hope was to ensure Westeros stood firm enough to resist any overreach, yet open enough to reap the benefits of peace. Time flowed onward. A year passed, then two. The pact with the Archie's coalition held, albeit with friction. Additional ships arrived, carrying more Valyrian merchants and minor nobles, some of whom sought out marriages with lesser Westerosi houses. A few alliances were formed. House Celtigar, with ancestral ties to Valyria, proved especially open to such matches. House Valerian, also of Valyrian descent, hosted elaborate feasts on Driftmark to welcome their distant kin. Aegon kept a close eye on these unions, wary that they might pave the way for political meddling. He mandated that any betrothal involving foreign families receive royal approval, a move that rankled some of the old Valyrian houses. But they acquiesced, not wishing to provoke the Targaryen crown so soon. Meanwhile, at court, the presence of Valyrian visitors stirred curiosity and some resentment among Westerosi lords. The Faith of the Seven quietly fumed at certain rumors of Valyrian blood rituals or the continued practice of incest in foreign enclaves. Aegon, mindful of the Faith's influence, gave the High Septon a new seat of worship in the capital, a grand sept to rival anything in Old Town. That gesture mollified the Faith somewhat, though the tension never fully dissipated. In the broader realm, pockets of discontent flared up now and then. Lords who muttered that the Targaryens were turning Westeros into a western province of the Freehold. Aegon made sure to address such fears with reassurances and displays of autonomy. He traveled personally to the Westerlands, the Reach, and the North, holding court in local seats, listening to grievances, and leaving behind a sense that the king cared for his subjects. Where words failed, dragons sufficed. None who witnessed Balerian's wingspan forgot the might behind the crown's courtesy. It was during one of these royal progresses, specifically, a journey through the Westerlands, that new tidings arrived from across the sea. Valyria was at war with itself, or so the rumors said. Accounts varied, but something had sparked a major conflict among several prominent families, possibly over territory in Sithorios or the Jade Sea. Armies were clashing, dragons were in the skies, and the death toll was rumored to be significant. Aegon received these rumors in the Golden Hall of Casterly Rock, seated beside Lord Lannister. The messenger, a Lyseni trader, brought the news breathlessly, claiming that entire fleets had been destroyed by dragonfire. This was no mere spat, but an outright civil war among factions in the Freehold. Lord Lannister's reaction was immediate. "Will they drag us into it, Your Grace? We rely on Valyrian trade routes for certain luxuries, but I'll not see our gold spent on a foreign war that offers us little gain." Aegon drummed his fingers against the arm of his seat. "We can't ignore it if it affects our realm. A civil war in Valyria might disrupt trade, cause an influx of refugees, or create new factions seeking alliances here." Privately, he suspected the Archie's coalition, the group that had negotiated with him, might be deeply involved in these hostilities. War among dragons in Valyria could reshape the balance of power drastically. If the coalition fell, a more hostile faction might emerge triumphant. Or, if the coalition triumphed, perhaps they'd tighten their grip on overseas lands, including Westeros. "Your Grace," Lord Lannister ventured, "pardon my candor, but it might be wise to limit any further Valyrian influence on our shores until this war is resolved. We don't want our people to become pawns in their power struggles." Aegon regarded the lord thoughtfully. "A prudent suggestion. I'll see to it that we carefully vet any newcomers. But we can't simply close our ports, either. That would do more harm than good. For now, we remain neutral." Within days, ravens flew from King's Landing to every major seat, informing lords of the situation and urging caution in dealing with Valyrian envoys. Visenya argued for a show of force, perhaps stationing dragons along the coasts to discourage any foreign fleet from using Westeros as a staging ground. Rhaenys, more diplomatic, proposed sending observers to Valyria to glean information. Aegon weighed both suggestions and decided on a middle path. He dispatched a small fleet to patrol the narrow sea, but with orders to allow legitimate trade. He also sent discreet envoys, Westerosi knights who spoke Valyrian, to the freehold, hoping to glean the truth of the conflict. The Watchers would not involve themselves in the fighting. They were there to gather information and return. Over the next few months, conflicting reports trickled back. Some said the conflict in Valyria was essentially a localized feud in the southern reaches, not a full-blown civil war. Others claimed entire wings of dragons had turned city districts to ash. A few speculated that the state of chaos was contained and would soon subside, while more dire whispers suggested that Valyria stood on the brink of fracturing under the weight of its own internal rivalries. Aegon's envoys eventually returned, each bearing fragmented accounts. It appeared that multiple factions were vying for control of certain trade routes, or perhaps access to sorcerers' forges deep in the Valyrian peninsula. Skirmishes had erupted, and some dragons were indeed involved, but the freehold's central authorities were trying to broker peace. No single faction had gained the upper hand. The Archie's coalition had not been destroyed, but they were locked in a bitter struggle with rival families. For Westeros, the immediate concern was that some of these factions might seek allies abroad. A few lesser Valyrian houses might flee to King's Landing, seeking shelter if they lost the war. Others, flush with victory, might demand concessions. The entire situation was fluid and dangerous. To prepare for any eventuality, Aegon convened his lords in King's Landing for the first great council of his reign, a gathering of the highest nobility and key advisors. The throne room, with its daunting iron throne, was filled with richly dressed lords from every region, while Targaryen banners hung from the rafters. Visenya, Rhaenys, and Aegon presided. Lord Stark, somber and quiet, observed from the fringes. Lord Lannister sat near the front, his golden hair catching the light. The Tyrells were present, their Lady Regent standing in place of the young lord who was ill. The Baratheons, Arryns, Tullis, Greyjoys, and various others filled the hall, each wearing their house colors. Even a Dornish envoy stood at the rear, though he had no official seat, as Dorne was not formally part of the realm. Aegon rose, and all voices hushed. "My lords, we face uncertain times. Valyria, the cradle of our dynasty, is racked by conflict. We cannot predict the outcome, but it may affect our trade and security. I have called you here to discuss how best to protect and strengthen our realm under these circumstances." He spoke of neutrality, caution, and readiness. Westeros need not meddle in the freehold's internal strife, but nor could it be complacent. His words were direct, lacking the flowery courtesies of some kings. The lords listened attentively, for even after these few years, many still remembered the searing heat of Dragonfire. Lord Lannister rose, urging a strong naval presence in the narrow sea to ward off any opportunistic raids. Lord Baratheon concurred, advocating the expansion of the royal fleet. Lady Tyrell pressed for continued open trade with those Valyrian houses deemed trustworthy, so the Reach's markets could thrive. Lord Stark said little, but his measured nod suggested agreement with the policy of neutrality. By the end of the council, a consensus formed. Westeros would remain watchful, expand its navy, and maintain trade with selected Valyrian houses under strict oversight. Aegon also secured pledges of troops from each region in case of emergencies, reinforcing the sense of unified defense. The Great Council ended on a cautious note, but it was a display of solidarity for the realm, a testament to how far Aegon's conquests had come in forging a unified kingdom. In private, Rhaenys told Aegon she was relieved. "They still see you as their undisputed liege. Even if they grumble about foreigners in the capital, they'd rather stand with you than face a Valyrian army alone." Aegon sighed. Yes, fear may have birthed this loyalty, but over time, perhaps it will deepen into something more. "For now, that's enough," Visenya, overhearing, quipped. "And if fear weakens, we have dragons to remind them." Her tone carried a half-jesting threat, but it rang true. The Targaryen advantage still rested largely on the presence of Balerion, Valyries, and Valith, though new hatchlings were growing in the royal dragon pit. A generation hence, there might be more dragons, and more riders among the Targaryen bloodline. That mention of children led to a personal matter. Heirs. Aegon and his sister wives had yet to produce a son. Rhaenys had borne a daughter 2 years prior, a bright-eyed child named Enya, but as a girl, her place in the line of succession was uncertain in Westerosi eyes. Valyrian tradition cared less about male versus female inheritance, but many in the Seven Kingdoms wanted a clear male heir. Visenya, too, had been with child once, but miscarried. She wore her disappointment with stoicism, burying it beneath her warrior's demeanor. Aegon, although outwardly calm, felt a growing weight of anxiety. Dynastic concerns might be trifling compared to wars and treaties, but a stable line of succession was crucial to the realm's long-term peace. Still, they had time. Enya was a toddler, healthy and bright. Perhaps fate would grant a son soon. If not, Aegon might have to break with certain Westerosi customs and name a daughter his heir, trusting in the strength of Dragonfire to enforce that decision. Such thoughts kept him awake at night, but he did not speak of them openly. While the realm braced for possible fallout from Valyria's internal conflict, everyday life continued. Rhaenys sponsored a harvest festival that brought throngs of small folk into King's Landing. Jugglers, dancers, and troubadours filled the streets with music. Farmers sold produce at bustling stalls. Even the usually stoic gold cloaks cracked a smile. Aegon walked among the crowds in simpler garb, wanting to gauge the city's mood. He saw children running with sweet buns, foreign merchants haggling in multiple tongues, and local craftsmen proudly displaying their wares. It was the vibrant hum of a city rising in ambition. A traveling mummers troupe staged a play depicting Aegon's conquest, complete with painted wooden dragons spitting colored smoke. The crowd roared in delight. Aegon watched from the back, amused at how the actors portrayed him as a larger-than-life figure, sword blazing with real fire. Perhaps a bit of myth-making was inevitable. He only hoped the next generation would appreciate the reality behind the legend, the countless hours spent in negotiation and governance, not just the glory of battle. Just as the festival reached its peak, a raven arrived from the narrow sea patrols. A large fleet had been sighted flying the banners of a Valyrian house unknown to them. The ships were heading west, possibly toward Duskendale or the Blackwater Bay. Alarm spread quickly. Could this be an invasion? A migration of refugees? Something else entirely? Aegon wasted no time. He summoned Visenya, who had just returned from a short trip to Dragonstone, and they took to the skies. Balerion and Valyries soared eastward, guided by scouts who had tracked the incoming fleet. The rumor spread through King's Landing that the king and queen had gone to confront a possible threat. The festival ended abruptly as fear rippled through the streets. High above the waters of the narrow sea, Aegon spotted the ships. At least 30, perhaps more. Their sails bore a stylized golden serpent on a purple field, a sigil Aegon did not recognize. Aegon and Visenya circled overhead, dragons roaring. On deck, men scurried in panic. If these vessels were up to no good, they would soon learn the price of antagonizing the Targaryens. A horn sounded from one of the leading ships. Flags were waved, apparently signaling that they meant no harm. Aegon and Visenya swooped lower, close enough to see the fear on the faces below, but high enough to evade any possible arrows or scorpions. No weapons were visible, though, and the ships appeared laden with cargo and families. Curious, Aegon guided Balerion into a downward spiral, flames flickering in the beast's throat as a warning. He landed on the wide deck of the largest ship, the wood creaking under Balerion's immense weight. Sailors scattered, some leaping into the water rather than stand near the Black Dread. Visenya hovered overhead, ready to attack if needed. A single figure approached Aegon, a lean, middle-aged man with Valyrian features, pale hair tied in a knot, eyes the color of amethyst. He sank to one knee, trembling. "Your Grace, I beg you, spare us." Aegon's eyes narrowed. "Who are you, and why do you sail into my domain uninvited?" "I am Morian Valerian," the man replied, voice quivering. We hail from the eastern districts of the freehold. Our house was attacked by rivals, our lands burned. We flee the war. We seek refuge. Aegon studied him carefully. The man wore rich robes, but they were tattered, and the others aboard looked like refugees indeed. Women, children, the elderly, all with haunted eyes. The hold was stacked with crates and chests, likely the last valuables they could salvage. "You expect refuge in Westeros?" Aegon demanded. Malarian raised his head. "We have gold, we have knowledge, we can serve. We only wish to escape the slaughter in Valyria. Our enemies butchered my kin. Please, King Aegon, you are known in the freehold as the mightiest dragon rider who carved out a new kingdom. Will you not grant us mercy?" Visenya circled above, watching for any sign of a trap. But from the vantage, it appeared these ships truly carried families, not soldiers. Aegon hesitated. If he turned them away, they might perish at sea or fall into some other faction's grasp. But if he allowed them to settle, he risked angering whichever enemy had driven them out, and possibly stirring unrest among Westerosi lords who already disliked the influx of Valyrians. He recalled the old stories of Valyria offering no refuge to those who fled. Now, ironically, Westeros might serve that role. Could it be a benefit? House Valerian, if that was their true name, might bring valuable skills. Or it could be the start of a flood of refugees that changed the kingdom's balance. Finally, Aegon spoke. "Very well. I will grant you landing rights for now, but you will disarm. You will swear loyalty to me, and you will abide by Westerosi laws. If I find you breaking faith, I will feed you to the Black Dread." Malarian bowed his head repeatedly, relief etched in every line of his face. "Thank you, Your Grace. We swear it." Aegon signaled Visenya to stand down. Together, they escorted the fleet to the mouth of the Blackwater. King's Landing woke in alarm at the sight of so many ships, but the presence of 2 dragons overhead kept any panic in check. Once docked, the refugees disembarked under the watchful eye of the gold cloaks. Many wept upon touching solid ground, grateful to be alive. Word spread quickly. A tide of Valyrian exiles had arrived. Some small folk peered at them curiously, noticing their foreign speech, their fine clothes, even battered. It was clear these were not simple folk. Rhaenys hurried to the docks, where she found Aegon overseeing the new arrivals. A flicker of worry crossed her face. "They're from the eastern districts, forced out by the war," he told her quietly. "They beg for refuge." Rhaenys nodded. "We can house some in the city, perhaps scatter others in the countryside. But this will raise questions. The lords will wonder how many more might come." Aegon understood. Still, his choice was made. He gestured for scribes to record the names of each refugee, gather their possessions, and find them temporary lodging. House Valerian's leaders, including Malarian, were brought to the Red Keep. There, they recounted the horrors of the conflict in the freehold. Entire neighborhoods burned by rival dragon riders, temples desecrated, slaves and freemen alike slaughtered without mercy. The war, they said, showed no sign of ending soon. As the days passed, more ships trickled in, some bearing scars of battle or arriving half-starved. A new wave of exiles washed onto Westerosi shores, many with stories of death and chaos in Valyria. Some claimed that highborn families were summoning demons or unleashing forbidden sorceries to gain an edge. The truth was hard to parse from rumor, but the picture that emerged was grim. Valyria was devouring itself. Suddenly, the question of infiltration and meddling took on a new dimension. These exiles weren't necessarily agents of any faction. They were fleeing for their lives. The moral dilemma was stark. Turning them away meant condemning them. Offering them shelter risked transforming King's Landing into a hub of displaced Valyrian houses, with all the political entanglements that entailed. Aegon tried to handle it systematically. He proclaimed that any Valyrian refugee must surrender arms upon entry and swear loyalty to the crown. They could not purchase large estates without permission, nor raise armed forces. They would be assigned areas to settle, some in the city, others in outlying villages. Skilled artisans were welcomed. Lords who complained about foreign competition were told that these were desperate families in need of succor. The Faith, for its part, saw an opportunity for conversions and demanded that the newcomers respect the Seven's holy sites. Tensions inevitably rose. Fights broke out in the streets between displaced Valyrians and resentful locals, each group blaming the other for rising prices, scarce housing, or perceived insults. Aegon ordered the Gold Cloaks to maintain order sternly. Visenya prowled the city on Valyries, roaring overhead to deter riots. Rhaenys took a more diplomatic approach, meeting with local guilds to reassure them that the refugees would contribute to the city's prosperity rather than destroy it. Lord Lannister wrote from Casterly Rock, warning that a flood of foreigners could destabilize the realm. Lord Baratheon offered to keep a garrison near the Blackwater to help manage the newcomers, a polite way of saying he wanted an armed presence close to the capital. Aegon politely declined, emphasizing that the crown was in control. Meanwhile, Morian Valerian and his kin petitioned for a small keep in the Crownlands to call their own, arguing that they needed a place to raise horses, store valuables, and re-establish their lost household. Aegon balked at granting them such a prize, fearing it would set a precedent. Instead, he gave them a modest estate near the Rosby Road, under strict watch by his stewards. It was far from the grand holdings they'd once possessed in Valyria, but Morian accepted it with humble gratitude, or so he portrayed. As the trickle of refugees continued, new alliances formed among them. Some exiles banded together in enclaves, pooling resources. Others pledged direct service to House Targaryen, hoping to gain favor. Every day, Aegon's court found itself fielding new requests for land, titles, trade licenses, each one a potential flashpoint for tension with native lords. Yet, for all the chaos, the realm did not collapse. The Targaryen monarchy, backed by dragons, stood as the ultimate arbiter. The exiles themselves were too disorganized to pose a unified threat. Most were content simply to survive. Months turned into a year, and a new normal took root. King's Landing grew more cosmopolitan, with Valyrian, Lyseni, Pentoshi, and Westerosi tongues mingling in the markets. Craftsmen fashioned signs in multiple languages. The city watch expanded, employing a few exiled soldiers who had sworn themselves wholeheartedly to Aegon. Reports from Valyria remained sporadic. Some said the conflict was winding down. Others insisted it was escalating. Whichever the case, enough devastation had already occurred to drive thousands from their homes. As the numbers of exiles reached a certain threshold, Aegon realized that Westeros had become a significant refuge for those fleeing Valyria's wars, a role he had never anticipated. One day, as he paced in the courtyard of the Red Keep, he found himself wondering about the shape of things to come. Had he unwittingly changed the fate of both continents by allowing these displaced Valyrians in? And what if a victorious faction in Valyria decided to pursue them, demanding their return or punishing them for treason? The ramifications were vast. "Your Grace," the voice belonged to Rhaenys, who stepped up behind him, her expression both warm and concerned. "You're troubled." He nodded, glancing at a group of Valyrian children playing with Westerosi children in the corner of the courtyard. They were all laughing, language barriers forgotten in their game of chase. "I wonder if we've become too entangled in Valyria's unraveling. If war spreads, we might be dragged deeper in." Rhaenys laid a hand on his arm. "We cannot close our eyes to people in need, Aegon. Nor can we pretend Valyria no longer exists." He sighed. "True. I just hope we can weather the storms that follow." She smiled gently. "We have dragons. We have a realm imperfect, yes, but ours. And we have each other. That is more than many can claim." He took solace in that, though a part of him still yearned for the simpler days when he was merely a conqueror, not the center of a grand geopolitical game. Yet fate cared little for what one man yearned for. If Valyria was devouring itself, Westeros under the Targaryens might rise as a power to rival it, or be forced into a confrontation that would shape the entire known world. And so Aegon walked on, beneath the red banners emblazoned with the three-headed dragon, forging onward through an uncertain future. Each footstep echoed across the courtyard's stone tiles, a testament to the path he had chosen. A path that had once led him from the glittering spires of Valyria to the dusty fields of Westeros, from conquest to kingship, from isolation to entanglement. The future was a tapestry woven of fire and hope, shadow and possibility. Aegon Targaryen would face it as he always had, with quiet determination, guided by the memory of dragons overhead and the promise of a realm that might endure beyond the storms of any doom, be it prophecy or politics, ever cast upon it. The days after the arrival of Morian Valyrian and his fellow refugees were marked by unease throughout King's Landing. Word spread quickly that the capital had taken in entire families fleeing war-torn Valyria, a gesture of mercy or folly, depending on which Westerosi lord one asked. In alleyways and taverns, whispered rumors grew. Some said the exiles might be spies for rival Valyrian factions. Others feared that more ships would soon arrive, overwhelming the city's resources. A small portion of the small folk, sympathizing with the plight of dispossessed families, donated food and clothing. Others resented the newcomers for driving up housing costs and competing for work. Already, the capital's population strained its narrow streets, and each new ship's arrival threatened chaos. Aegon Targaryen spent those days in near-constant motion, issuing royal decrees on provisioning, ordering the city watch to quell unrest before it erupted, and convening with Rhaenys and Visenya on matters both large and small. The Red Keep's halls bustled with scribes who kept track of every arrival, every oath sworn, every complaint lodged by local guilds. Even the newly built wings of the castle seemed cramped with the volume of people seeking the king's ear. Visenya argued that the best way to keep order was through visible deterrence. She took Valyries on short flights above the city every few mornings, letting the citizenry glimpse green-scaled wings sweeping over rooftops. She had no patience for mobs or petty riots. If some group threatened violence against the refugees, or if refugees themselves caused unrest, Visenya vowed she would unleash flame without hesitation. That stern approach, while effective in the short term, worried some of Aegon's counselors, who feared it might sow deeper resentment. Rhaenys preferred a gentler route. She organized a small council dedicated to integrating the new arrivals. Where possible, skilled Valyrian artisans were introduced to local guild masters, forging alliances that could stimulate trade. Families were encouraged to settle in outlying hamlets rather than clustering in cramped city wards. She worked tirelessly, sometimes late into the night, meeting with merchants, bailiffs, and local headmen to negotiate land use. Her presence reassured many refugees, who saw in the queen a softer face than that of Visenya, and Aegon himself moved between both approaches, struggling to balance them. On one hand, he recognized the moral imperative to offer safety to those fleeing a brutal civil war. He had once been a young dragon lord in Valyria himself, after all, and knew how savage the city's rivalries could be. On the other, he could not ignore the grumblings of Westerosi lords who urged the crown to halt the influx, lest the realm be subverted from within. Such tensions simmered on, day after day, while new information about the civil strife in Valyria emerged piecemeal. Raven after raven arrived bearing letters from Aegon's envoys, now scattered through the freehold's edges and allied cities. From these updates, a picture gradually formed. Multiple alliances of older Valyrian houses were clashing, each seeking dominance over key trade routes, each believing it had the right to rule or at least reshape large portions of the freehold. Some rumored that the Archie's coalition, formerly so powerful, had fractured into subfactions. Others reported that certain sorcerer lords had begun conjuring unnatural forces, twisting dragons with dark magics. Though the truth was buried in rumor, what was certain was that the conflict had grown beyond a mere regional flare-up. The question looming in King's Landing was how far that conflict might extend, and whether, at some point, one faction or another would arrive to demand that Aegon's new kingdom stop harboring exiles. Many in the city remembered that Aegon himself had built his realm on the back of Balerion, the Black Dread, an immense dragon whose legend alone might deter a foreign invasion. But Valyria had many dragons, perhaps hundreds, and if they truly unified under a single cause, even the Targaryens might be hard-pressed to stop them. Amid these wider concerns, daily life pressed on. The harbor was abuzz with new trade. Ships from Pentos and Tyrosh, laden with goods, vying for mooring space alongside the burgeoning refugee vessels. Markets swelled with foreign wares. Occasional fistfights broke out over currency exchange or misunderstandings in half a dozen languages. The gold cloaks, patrolling in greater numbers than ever before, did their best to maintain order. Even so, the entire city had the feeling of an overstuffed wineskin. One more squeeze, and it might burst. Near the Red Keep's main gates, a cluster of Valyrian refugees often gathered at dawn, hoping to petition the king directly. Occasionally, Aegon ventured among them, guarded by a handful of Kingsguard knights. He would listen to pleas. Families seeking farmland, dragon handlers needing stables, artisans wanting to open a forge. Most requests had to be funneled through the bureaucracy. Aegon could not personally grant every petition, but he made a point of showing himself. People needed to see that he was neither tyrant nor absentee ruler. On one such morning, a fragile hush accompanied the king's arrival. The refugees parted like a wave, bowing their heads. A small child, no more than 5 or 6, stared up at Aegon with wide violet eyes, reminding him strangely of himself at that age. He paused, crouching to speak to the boy, who clung to his mother's skirts. The mother wore tattered robes of fine silk, clearly once wealthy, like so many others. "Where is your family from?" Aegon asked gently. The mother swallowed hard. "Near Orion Peak in Valyria, your grace. My husband stayed to defend our home. I do not know if he still lives." Her voice trembled with heartbreak. Aegon reached out, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You are under my protection now," he said. "I will see that you and your son find shelter. Speak to the royal stewards. They will guide you." She attempted a grateful smile, tears brimming. Aegon stood, signaled one of his attendants to assist her. Moments like that underscored the personal tragedy behind the grand political drama. And at times such tragedies weighed heavily on him. For all the talk of forging a new realm, he could never forget that these were flesh and blood people, not just pieces in a Game of Thrones. But not all in the city were so moved by compassion. Whispers circulated in the Street of Steel, a district known for smithies and metalworkers, that certain guild members had begun forming secret associations to resist foreign influence. More ominously, there were rumors of masked men prowling after dark, harassing or even assaulting lone refugees. The gold cloaks did their best to quell these incidents, but they could not be everywhere. More than once, Rhaenys confronted Aegon with these concerns, urging him to tighten the watch, set curfews if necessary. Aegon hesitated, fearing to appear too heavy-handed with his own subjects. A delicate balance had to be struck, and finding it grew more challenging each day. Then came the fateful summons from Dragonstone. A raven arrived late one evening, its message brief. Lord Ethan Valerian, master of Driftmark, had spotted a fleet heading toward the island. At least 20 warships, flying a sigil that combined black and silver serpents. Not the same exiles who had arrived in King's Landing. This was something else, perhaps an organized faction from Valyria. They were expected to reach Dragonstone's waters in less than a week. Immediately, Aegon called his queens to council. Visenya's reaction was the most direct. Mount the dragons and intercept the fleet before it reached the island. Rhaenys counseled caution. Perhaps these newcomers wished to negotiate, to speak with Aegon about the exiles. Aegon decided that more information was needed before they risked open battle. He dispatched swift ships from King's Landing to join Valerian scouts in the waters around Dragonstone, hoping to identify the newcomers' intentions. Those same waters, cold and choppy in the autumn breeze, soon became a stage for tense maneuvering. Valyrian galleys, sleek and reinforced with iron, pressed forward. The Driftmark scouts kept a measured distance, relaying signals back to Dragonstone. On the island, the black stone fortress braced itself, manning ballistae that had been installed over the years. Dragons from Aegon's brood, lesser ones than Balerian or Villeries, not yet fully grown, roost within the castle's walls, ready to take flight if threatened. Aegon hurried to Dragonstone on Balerian, taking Visenya and Rhaenys with him. They arrived amid swirling clouds, black wings casting a massive shadow over the fortress courtyard. At once, the household swarmed to greet them, Lord Valyrian, silver-haired and regal, bowed deeply. Your Grace, the fleet draws near. We've exchanged only distant signals thus far. They have not attacked, but they sail with weapons clearly visible. We fear they may be ready to challenge your rule. Perhaps they aim to seize Dragonstone for themselves. Aegon's eyes narrowed. They will not seize what is mine without a fight. Visenya tested the edge of her blade, dark sister, as if anticipating a battle. Rhaenys, however, remained calm, insisting that they send out a longboat under a flag of parley. Let us see if they come in peace, she said. If they lie, we shall answer with dragonfire. Aegon agreed, albeit warily. So it was that a longboat bearing the Targaryen banner rode out under overcast skies. On board were a handful of trusted men, knights of the Kingsguard and a Valyrian captain, to approach the lead warship. From his vantage on Dragonstone's highest turret, Aegon watched through a Myrish lens as the two sides conferred. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw gestures, points to the sky, heads nodding. At last, the longboat returned. Its captain, drenched in sea spray, rushed to present himself to Aegon. Your Grace, they claim to be envoys of House Malarian, a family allied with the Eastern War faction in Valyria. They say they have no intent to fight you, only to speak with you regarding the exiles now in your care. They claim those exiles are traitors to the rightful authorities in Valyria. Traitors, Visenya scoffed. Hardly a surprise. Every rival faction calls the other traitors. Rhaenys asked, did they provide any proof of what authority they serve? Do they come at the behest of the Freehold's central councils? Or are they simply another warlord alliance? The captain shook his head. They gave no formal document from the main council, only letters bearing the sigil of House Malarian, which they say is recognized by a majority of the city's conclave. Aegon peered out at the distant ships, bobbing on steel-gray waves. They come with a war fleet, that much is clear. But if they truly wish to force the issue, they might have attacked already. Perhaps they do hope to negotiate. Visenya smirked. Negotiation can be a prelude to intimidation. True, Aegon allowed. All the same, I'll hear them. I'll not turn away envoys who fly a flag of truce. They arranged a meeting in Dragonstone's throne room, an older hall built centuries ago by Valyrian stonemasons, with walls of dark basalt carved into grotesque dragon shapes. Torchlight flickered off the polished floor as Aegon and his queens took their seats on the raised dais. The knights and men-at-arms formed a protective cordon. Outside, Valyrian's roar shook the walls, a reminder that the Black Dread was never far. The envoys from House Malarian entered with careful steps. Leading them was a tall woman with hair so pale it was nearly white, braided with silver rings. She wore armor inlaid with delicate Valyrian glyphs, and her eyes flicked warily around the hall. Behind her strode half a dozen attendants in robes, carrying chests and scrolls. She bowed low, then introduced herself in the liquid syllables of High Valyrian. I am Elian Malarian, daughter of Geralt Malarian, whose house stands at the forefront of restoring order in Valyria. I greet you, Aegon Targaryen, and your queens. Aegon responded in High Valyrian, though his accent carried the rough edges of years spent away from the freehold. Well met, Lady Elian. May you find safety here. Her smile was thin. My father would be gladdened to hear that I am safe. We have come a long way to speak with you on urgent business. We understand that your kingdom has granted shelter to certain traitors from the eastern districts, those who turned against the rightful rule of the city. In doing so, we fear you have unwittingly embroiled yourself in our conflict. Rhaenys interjected softly. Your conflict is tearing Valyria apart. From what we hear, we have given refuge to innocent families fleeing death and destruction. Elian's gaze fixed on Rhaenys. Innocent? Many of those who fled bore arms against their fellow citizens or incited revolts among the slave population. While your pity may be commendable, your kindness is misdirected. We ask that you return these criminals to face judgment in Valyria. In exchange, House Malarian pledges to maintain amicable relations with your realm. Silence fell across the hall. Aegon felt Visenya's anger simmering beside him, but he spoke first. You assume we accept your version of events. Tell me, Lady Elian, what official sanction do you hold from the Freehold's highest councils? She inclined her head. As you know, the central authority in Valyria has been weakened by the war, but a majority of the older houses recognize House Malarian as leading the rightful cause. We have been entrusted with the responsibility to root out sedition and restore peace. Your acceptance of these exiles hinders that cause, and may provoke factions less inclined to diplomacy. Aegon weighed his next words carefully. Those who have come to Westeros have, by and large, posed no threat to my rule. They claim they were driven from their homes by unrestrained violence and have sworn loyalty to me for sanctuary. I will not hand them over to be executed, or worse, without clear evidence of wrongdoing. Elian's expression hardened. Will you defy the will of Valyria's leading houses? Then, we came hoping to find an ally in House Targaryen, not an impediment. Visenya leaned forward, her voice as cold as the basalt walls. We forged this realm ourselves, and we do not answer to any house in Valyria. You might remember that before hurling about threats, my lady. Elian's attendants shifted uneasily, sensing the tension. One coughed nervously before presenting a scroll to Aegon's steward. Elian continued, We do not wish for conflict. Indeed, we bring gifts and proposals for future trade cooperation. Should you see reason, it would be a boon to both our peoples if we ended this matter peacefully. Rhaenys took the scroll from the steward, unrolling it. It detailed an offer: new trade privileges for Targaryen-held Westeros, a place in the reconstituted conclave for Aegon, or a representative, and assistance in managing the exiles. The language was carefully chosen. Managing seemed to mean removing them or subjecting them to interrogation. Aegon's face remained impassive as he folded his hands. We will consider your proposals. But know this, my first duty is to the people who have bent the knee to me, whether they are born in Westeros or fled from elsewhere. Any arrangement must respect their safety and rights under my laws. Elian's eyes narrowed slightly, but she inclined her head in a semblance of agreement. Very well. We shall remain off Dragonstone's coast for a time, while you deliberate. Please do not keep us waiting long. My father grows impatient, and other factions in Valyria might not be as courteous. With that, the envoys withdrew, leaving tension in their wake. As soon as they were gone, Visenya exclaimed, We should chase them away now, Aegon. They come with a fleet half likely to launch an attack if we don't yield. I say we burn their ships before they threaten us further. Rhaenys looked troubled. That risks open war with a powerful faction of the Freehold. Are we prepared to fight them? We might defeat a fleet at sea, but if they bring more dragons— Aegon rose from his seat. We must tread carefully. If I turn over the exiles, I betray the principle on which we accepted them. But if we defy Malarian outright, it could spark a larger conflict. For now, I'll keep them at bay with promises of negotiation. That will buy us time to strengthen our defenses and consult with our allies in Westeros. He ordered ravens sent to King's Landing, Driftmark, and key lords across the realm, urging caution and readiness. Visenya agreed to remain at Dragonstone with Valyrian, while Aegon and Rhaenys would return to the capital to coordinate. The next morning, under a gray sky, Aegon took flight on Valyrian, Rhaenys on Valyth behind him, leaving Visenya in command of the island's garrison. When they arrived in King's Landing, they found the mood tense but calm. No new ships had appeared in the harbor, and the city's day-to-day bustle continued. Yet the news of a hostile Valyrian fleet near Dragonstone circulated, fueling anxiety among the populace. Some feared an imminent siege of the capital. Others, mainly the newer refugees, dreaded that Malarian's forces would land and begin dragging them back in chains. Among the exiles, Morian Valyrian in particular seemed panicked, for House Malarian had apparently been a longtime rival of his own family. He sought an immediate audience with Aegon, pressing for reassurance that he and his kin would not be surrendered. Aegon tried to calm him, though he could offer no ironclad guarantee. I do not hand over those who have bent the knee to me lightly, Aegon told him in the Red Keep's audience chamber. Remain in the crown's protection, abide by our laws, and I will not forsake you. Morian's relief was palpable, but he still seemed on edge. He offered to raise a small militia of exiled Valyrian men to fight if Malarian landed. Aegon politely declined. Arming hundreds of refugees with questionable loyalties could create more problems than it solved. Instead, he told Morian that the crown would handle matters, and if fighting broke out, exiles could assist the city watch in non-combat roles. In the days that followed, Aegon consulted with his lords about the brewing crisis. Lord Baratheon recommended immediate mobilization of the royal army, while Lord Lannister stressed the need to guard the western coasts in case Malarian tried to circumvent Dragonstone. Lady Tyrell pledged supplies of grain and provisions. House Arryn remained outwardly supportive, though they seemed reluctant to commit large forces. The North, always distant, sent word that their men would respond if the crown formally called its banners. But for now, Torrhen Stark maintained a stance of watchful neutrality. By the time northern troops arrived, the conflict might be over. Aegon tried to gauge how the city itself would react to a Valyrian threat. Some pockets of the population were so resentful of the refugees that they saw a Valyrian army as a punishment for hosting them. Others rallied behind the king, proud of Targaryen sovereignty. The Faith of the Seven, through the High Septon in the newly built Great September, preached that the crown must not yield to foreign demands, lest Westeros become subservient to heathenish powers. Meanwhile, Aelian Malarian's fleet lingered near Dragonstone, neither attacking nor departing. Visenya sent regular updates by Raven. She described how the ships sometimes shifted positions or launched small boats, perhaps testing defenses. She occasionally took Valyrians into the skies, letting them see a dragon overhead, her way of reminding them that any assault would be met with fire. It was a stalemate waiting for a spark. Aegon's patience wore thin. If Malarian truly intended diplomacy, they could have visited King's Landing directly. Their continued presence off Dragonstone's coast suggested they hoped to intimidate him into submission. At times, he was tempted to call his banners, mount Valyrian, and burn the warships to cinders. Yet he knew that might only provoke a larger retaliation from Valyria. Finally, a new approach presented itself. Rhaenys proposed that they invite Aelian Malarian and a few of her counselors to come to King's Landing, under safe conduct, to negotiate directly about the exiles. Perhaps, Rhaenys reasoned, seeing the scale of Aegon's realm might dissuade Malarian from aggression, or at least reduce the risk of a misunderstanding that led to war. If Aelian refused, it would reveal her motives as hostile. If she accepted, there was a chance for a more permanent settlement. Aegon agreed, drafting a formal invitation. Malarian's delegation would be guaranteed safe passage to and from King's Landing, escorted by Targaryen ships, to discuss the matter of refugees and any other concerns. The letter set a date a fortnight hence, demanding a swift response. Visenya, ever vigilant, worried that the invitation might allow spies into the heart of the capital. But Rhaenys insisted that refusing to even try diplomacy risked war. A raven carried the invitation to Dragonstone. Then a small boat sailed out under a flag of truce to deliver it to the lead Malarian vessel. Days passed with no reply. The tension grew excruciating. Nobody in King's Landing knew if a Valyrian attack might come at any moment. Then a single Malarian galley arrived in the bay, its black and silver serpent banner trailing in the wind. City watchmen scrambled along the docks, uncertain whether to treat it as an enemy or a guest. By Aegon's order, the ship was permitted to land, albeit under tight guard. The travelers who disembarked bore the same sigil as Aelian, though she herself was not among them. The lead official, a middle-aged Valyrian with a scraggly beard and anxious eyes, bowed before the assembled royal retinue. He introduced himself as Talus Malarian, a cousin of Aelian's. My lady regrets she cannot leave her command at Dragonstone's coast, but she sends me to treat with you, he explained. Aegon's frustration flared. Aelian's refusal to attend in person felt like a snub. Still, he led Talus and his small delegation to a private hall within the Red Keep. Rhaenys joined him, while knights of the Kingsguard stood watch. Wine was offered, but Talus declined, perhaps wary of poison. "What is your lady's response to our invitation?" Aegon asked, keeping his composure. "She thanks you for the courtesy," Talus said, but must remain vigilant. She asks that you send envoys to her flagship instead, if you wish direct negotiations. As a gesture of good faith, she has sent me to discuss broad terms. Visenya, who had flown in from Dragonstone for this meeting, scoffed. Broad terms? Such as hand over the refugees or we burn your city? Talus squirmed. We do not wish to burn anything, but House Malarian demands the return of specific individuals responsible for treason and murder in Valyria. If you cannot comply, we ask that you at least allow our agents to come ashore and identify those who must face justice. A ripple of anger passed through Aegon. The arrogance was clear. Malarian wanted to operate within his realm as if it were an extension of Valyria. He forced his voice to remain level. Westeros is no hunting ground for foreign inquisitions. I will not permit your men to roam my streets rounding up people without my consent. The exiles you call criminals have pledged loyalty to me. If they have committed crimes, bring me proof and I will judge according to my laws. I do not hand them to you blindly. Talus placed a palm over his heart, as if offended. Your Grace, we feared you might say so. Yet you must understand, House Malarian has lost kin to these rebels. We have documents detailing their crimes. If you refuse to let us recover them, you choose to harbor murderers. Rhaenys calmly tapped her fingers on the table. You speak of documents. Show them. We will have our maesters examine your evidence. If it is found credible, and it concerns individuals who indeed participated in murder, we will handle it ourselves. Talus did not look pleased. You would let them walk free, then, rather than face justice in Valyria? Rhaenys shot him a cold look. We do not recognize that you alone define justice. This is Aegon's realm. A stalemate followed. Talus insisted Malarian's demands were reasonable. Aegon's side refused to yield. Eventually, Talus conceded that he would provide some records for review, but insisted that the criminals must ultimately be returned for trial in Valyria. Aegon made no promise in that regard. By the time the meeting ended, no real compromise had been reached. Talus took his leave, returning to his galley with a promise to deliver the relevant documents as soon as possible. When he had gone, Visenya turned to Aegon. They want a foothold here, that much is clear. If you permit them to land agents, soon they'll have troops patrolling the streets. They'll find 1,000 excuses to take not just the exiles, but anyone who displeases them. Aegon nodded slowly, a headache throbbing behind his temples. Yes, this is less about justice and more about extending their power. But if we refuse entirely, they might attempt to seize what they want by force. Rhaenys exhaled. We can't remain in limbo forever. Sooner or later, either Malarian attacks or they back down. Perhaps we should consider forging a stronger alliance with other Valyrian factions opposed to Malarian, like the Archie's coalition we once dealt with. Visenya's mouth twisted. Exchanging one outside entanglement for another? Dangerous, but perhaps it's inevitable. Aegon's mind raced. We have to choose carefully whom we trust. The coalition itself is rumored to be fractured, but if we can show Malarian that we have powerful allies across the sea, they might think twice about pressing us. So they weighed the possibility of discreetly reaching out to rival houses in Valyria who might prefer Targaryen neutrality or even friendship. To do so, though, would be a gamble. It might draw Westeros even deeper into Valyria's civil war. In the days that followed, Talus Malarian sent a packet of parchments to the Red Keep. They were written in dense Valyrian script, outlining alleged crimes of numerous exiles. Aegon had his maesters translate and compare them to testimonies from the refugees themselves. The result was a chaotic tangle. Some refugees did appear to have led militant uprisings. Others were merely accused of treasonous sympathies. And murder cases mentioned by Malarian were often contradicted by accounts that pinned the blame on House Malarian's own soldiers. The more Aegon delved into it, the more it reeked of scapegoating. He found no clear evidence that the exiles had committed wrongdoing beyond the usual atrocities of war, nor that Malarian was guiltless. If anything, the documents revealed just how murky the conflict in Valyria had become. Each side claimed to be righteous, each side accused the other of horror. Eventually, Aegon summoned Morian Valyrian and a handful of other prominent refugees whose names appeared most frequently in the scrolls. He asked them to explain their roles in the events described. Morian's face went pale when he saw the parchments. "I will not deny that my kin took up arms," Morian admitted, "but only to defend ourselves from Malarian aggression. They attacked our lands, burned our fields. We had no choice but to fight." Another refugee, a woman from House Nazarian, insisted that Malarian's charges of murder were fabricated. "They marched through our district killing anyone who would not swear loyalty to them. Are we to blame for resisting?" Aegon listened, trying to parse truth from propaganda. He concluded that the exiles were not blameless. In war, no side often is, but the idea of handing them over to Malarian's tender mercies became increasingly unthinkable. They would likely be tortured or executed, and any trial would be a farce. Time was running out. Messages from Dragonstone reported that Elian Malarian had begun staging small drills at sea, as if preparing her sailors for battle. She refused to move her fleet away. The number of ships she commanded seemed to be growing. Perhaps more had sailed in to bolster her position. Visenya, tasked with overseeing the island's defense, warned that any day might bring the first shots of war. Yet open conflict with Malarian might only be the start. If that faction controlled a significant slice of Valyria's power base, they could send word back across the sea and bring a larger Dragonlord host. Aegon's own realm would be the new battleground. At a tense meeting in the Red Keep's council chamber, with lords from the Crownlands, the Westerlands, and the Stormlands present, Aegon laid out the situation. Silence fell when he finished. Then Lord Baratheon spoke, blunt as ever. "We cannot let Valyria bully us. If you yield on this point, your grace, we will always be at their mercy. I say we muster the greatest army we can, line the coasts with archers and siege engines, and burn their fleet if it attempts to land." Lord Lannister concurred, though less heatedly. "The gold mines of my region are strong. We can finance war if needed, but we must be prepared to hold nothing back. If the rumored Dragonlords of Malarian arrive, we need every measure of defense." Lord Celtigar, who had Valyrian ancestry, wrung his hands. "Yet if we do this, we commit ourselves to battle with a faction that might only be the first wave. What if the other houses unite behind them? We cannot stand alone against the entire might of Valyria." Aegon's voice was resolute. "I will not hand over refugees who have bent the knee. That is the decision. The question is how best to enforce it without plunging us into ruin. Let us pray Malarian's faction stands alone." Rhaenys offered her own idea. "We could attempt to open contact with the Archie's coalition once more, or any other group in Valyria that stands against Malarian. If they see us as an ally, or at least not an enemy, they might keep Malarian in check." Baratheon snorted. "Making pacts with foreign powers to fight foreign powers. Where does it end?" "Wherever it must," Aegon said quietly. "But I would rather fight from a position of strength, with potential allies, than stand alone." So it was decided. Aegon would send swift ships east, seeking an audience with known coalition leaders, if any still existed, or any other Valyrian factions open to common ground. The mission would be secret, entrusted to a few skilled envoys who understood both Westerosi and Valyrian politics. Meanwhile, the Crownlands would prepare for war. Aegon called upon House Baratheon to bring a corps of troops to King's Landing, House Lannister to commit funds, and House Velaryon to strengthen the royal fleet. Quietly, Aegon ordered the forging of more Scorpion-like siege engines, re-engineered from older Valyrian designs, a precaution for if or when Malarian's dragons appeared. The city's walls saw new fortifications, and the dragon pit near the Red Keep was put on high alert. The watchers trained day and night. The city's blacksmiths toiled at forging spears tipped with iron barbs rumored to pierce dragon scales if aimed properly. Perhaps none of it would matter if the full might of Valyria descended, but Aegon refused to be caught unprepared. A sullen atmosphere gripped King's Landing as the weeks passed. People sensed the tension. Refugees who had once roamed the streets more freely now stayed close to enclaves or hidden corners, afraid of retribution if war broke out. Westerosi's small folk hoarded food, worried about sieges. craftsmen rushed orders for the crown, forging arms and armor day and night. At Dragonstone, Visenya maintained a vigilant watch. She and Valyria soared daily across the skies, scanning the horizon for any sign that Malarian's fleet was mobilizing. The enemy ships remained anchored at a respectable distance, occasionally sending out smaller boats to scout the coastline. Sometimes, Visenya threatened them with a low pass on Dragonback, enough to drive them away without igniting a battle. But every day, the tension ratcheted higher. Then, early one morning, a messenger arrived from Dragonstone with alarming news. Ellian Malarian had sent raiding parties ashore on the far side of the island. They'd clashed with local guards, capturing a handful of fishermen and minor Valyrian bannermen. Visenya had repelled them with a swift strike, burning their landing craft with dragonfire and forcing them back to the sea. But the incursion was a blatant escalation, an act of war. Aegon wasted no time. Within hours, he was aloft on Valyrian, with Rhaenys and Vaelith following. They soared over the narrow sea, the wind lashing at their faces. Beneath them, the royal fleet set out from Blackwater Bay, led by war galleys newly outfitted with siege engines on their decks. The plan was simple: confront Malarian with overwhelming force, demand they release any prisoners, and withdraw from the island. If they refused, the Targaryens would strike first. Upon reaching Dragonstone, Aegon spied columns of smoke along the rocky shore, signs of the recent skirmish. Visenya stood on one of the fortress's upper battlements, signaling them to land. As soon as they dismounted, she stalked forward, fury in her eyes. "They came in small boats at dawn," she reported. "Took some locals by surprise. I was in the sky soon after, and Valyrians roasted 2 of their skiffs. They fled, but they took captives, don't know where they are. Likely on one of their galleys." Aegon clenched his jaw. "This cannot stand. Where is Ellian?" Visenya gestured out to sea. "Still aboard her flagship, from what we can see. She's playing games, Aegon, testing our resolve or luring us into a trap." Rhaenys frowned. "If she's taken hostages, it might be to force our hand. Perhaps she hopes to trade them for the exiles." Visenya spat over the parapet. "We should incinerate the fleet. Enough talk." Aegon paused, torn between wrath and caution. "We'll try one last parley. If they refuse to leave or free the hostages, we attack." So, on a windy afternoon, 3 dragons lifted from Dragonstone's courtyard, Valyrian, Valyrian, Vaelith, and flew in a wedge formation toward the anchored fleet. The warships bobbed in the gray sea, decks bristling with men who looked like ants from the height. The largest vessel in the center bore Malarian's banner. Aegon guided Valyrian into a slow, menacing circle overhead. A single arrow hissed skyward, missing Valyrian by yards. Visenya's anger flared, but she heeded Aegon's gesture to hold back. Firing a single arrow might have been a nervous reaction rather than an open attack, though it was still a dangerous sign. A rowboat launched from the flagship, a white cloth fluttering at its bow. Cautious, the Targaryens flew back to the Dragonstone beach, allowing the rowboat to come ashore. A single figure emerged, Talus Malarian again, looking more anxious than before. He approached with arms raised, unarmed, meeting Aegon at the water's edge. "We have your fishermen," Talus said. "They are unharmed for now. Lady Ellian demands that you hand over Morian Valerian and the other criminals listed in our records. Only then will she release her hostages and depart." Aegon's temper simmered. "Your lady has no authority to make such demands on my soil. You come here, seize my people, and then claim we must bargain for their lives? Do you know who you're dealing with?" Talus trembled, sweat beading on his brow. "I beg you, do not do anything rash. Lady Ellian is prepared for a fight. She has more ships on the way. This does not need to end in blood if you simply hand over." Visenya cut him off with a glare that could melt steel. "We will never yield to blackmail. You want to see rash? Keep testing us." Talus spread his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "Please, surely there is a path to agreement. We do not seek a full-scale war. We only want those who spilled Malarian blood." Rhaenys interjected, her tone calmer than Visenya's but no less firm. There can be no trust between us so long as you hold innocent people captive. Release them first. Then we might speak of some compromise. Talas's face fell. Lady Ellian will not do that unless she receives something in return. Aegon glanced at the horizon, where the Malarian fleet loomed. The wind carried a tang of salt and tension. He closed his eyes, recalling the horrors he'd seen from the sky in the war for Westeros. Entire armies turned to ash. The memory fueled his resolve. Tell Ellian that if she does not withdraw immediately and free my people, she will find herself facing Valyrian's fire. All her reinforcements will not save her fleet. Westeros will not bow to threats. Talas swallowed hard. Your Grace, do not force her hand. If you refuse, go, Aegon snarled. You have my terms. Talas retreated to his rowboat, clearly fearing for his life. The Targaryens waited on the beach, silent. Soldiers from Dragonstone lined the cliffs. Ballistae aimed at sea. The dragons paced behind their riders, wings rustling impatiently. The afternoon sun dipped lower, painting the waters gold and crimson. Time stretched like a bowstring. Then, on the horizon, they saw the Malarian flagship's sails unfurl. One by one, the ships around it began to move. An exhale of relief spread among the Targaryen soldiers. Had Ellian chosen to depart? But as Aegon and his queens watched, the formation of the ships changed. They were not retreating. They were maneuvering into an offensive line, oars splashing in unison. A faint horn call reached them on the wind. Visenya's smile was grim. So she's made her choice. Aegon felt his heart pound. There would be no more half measures. Ready the fortress, he ordered. Archers and scorpions to the walls. We'll meet them in the sky. Rhaenys mounted Valeth, Visenya climbed onto Viserys, and Aegon swung into the saddle on Balerian's neck. The dragons roared in unison, great serpentine shapes rising against the darkening sky. Soldiers cheered, the sound mingling with the crash of waves. They ascended, circling wide around the island. From above, they observed the Malarian warships advancing. Aegon spotted at least 30, possibly more. Small shapes on the decks indicated ballistae or similar siege weapons. The Targaryen fleet from King's Landing was still hours away, so it fell to the dragons to hold the line. Visenya, eyes blazing, looked to Aegon. He gave a nod. In a swift dive, she guided Viserys toward the nearest cluster of ships, unleashing a jet of emerald fire that streaked across the water. The lead warship tried to turn aside, but flames licked at its sails, setting them ablaze. Shouts and screams echoed upward. Another spray of dragonfire caught the next vessel. 2 ships were burning within moments, black smoke curling into the sky. Still, the Malarian fleet pressed on. Aegon saw arrows and bolts launched upward. Most fell short, but a few soared alarmingly close to the dragons, who banked and wheeled to evade. From the flagship, a large scorpion bolt shot upward. It missed Viserys by scant feet, whistling past. Visenya retaliated by diving toward that vessel, her dragon's jaws gaping with flame. But the Malarian crew swiftly turned their vessel, the scorpion reloading. A wild dance ensued over the waves. Dragons spat fire. Warships maneuvered desperately. Flaming wrecks drifted. Visenya inflicted heavy damage, but the Malarian mariners proved disciplined. They fired ballista bolts in timed salvos, forcing the dragons to dodge. One lucky shot grazed Valeth's left wing. Rhaenys cried out as she felt the jolt through her saddle. Blood spattered the air. She veered away, retreating momentarily to assess the injury. Seeing his sister's dragon wounded, Aegon's rage flared. He and Valyrian descended like a hammer. The Black Dread's flame cascaded across 2 more ships, igniting them from prow to stern. Screams echoed as men burned alive or hurled themselves into the sea. The heat was so intense that it scorched the salt spray. From Dragonstone's walls, ballistae joined in, hurling iron-tipped bolts at the invaders. One missile punched through a Malarian deck, skewering 6 men. Another struck a mast, toppling it into the water. Slowly, the once proud war fleet's formation disintegrated, ships in flames or drifting aimlessly. Amid the chaos, the flagship, a massive galley with reinforced sides, held its position stubbornly. Aegon spied catapults on its deck, loaded with something that glowed in the twilight, possibly jars of wildfire or some other volatile substance. If they managed a direct hit on one of the dragons, the results could be devastating. Visenya knew it too. She signaled Rhaenys to flank while she attacked from the front. The two soared in a coordinated strike, forcing the flagship's crew to split their aim. Valyrians rained fire from the sky, but a ballista bolt whistled upward, nearly striking Visenya's dragon. She barely rolled aside in time, missing the shot by mere yards. A second ballista aimed for Valyth, but Rhaenys had already climbed, out of range. Aegon saw his opening. With the flagship's weapons focused on the queens, he dove on Balerion from a blind angle. The monstrous dragon unleashed a hurricane of flame that engulfed the stern. Fire danced across the deck, and a moment later, a sudden explosion rocked the ship, likely the ignition of those catapults' chemical payload. Fire and screams erupted in a brilliant burst. The flagship cracked as if torn in half. Men scrambled in vain to put out the flames. In the dying light of day, the once proud Malarian armada was a scene of carnage. Half a dozen ships still floated, battered and disorganized, some dragging burning sails behind them. The rest were sunk, sinking, or adrift in flames. Bodies bobbed in the waves. A few rafts and lifeboats scattered, carrying survivors who paddled frantically away from the dragons. Circling overhead, Aegon sought any sign of Elian Malarian. Had she escaped on a smaller vessel, or gone down with her flagship? It was impossible to tell in the chaos. Visenya soared lower, scanning for any sign of a commanding presence. She saw only terrified faces, drowning men, and the wreckage of war. Rhaenys, blood on her cheek from Valyth's minor wound, hovered at Aegon's side. Do we press them? Hunt down every last survivor? Aegon gazed at the horror below. For a moment, he recalled the field of fire in Westeros, a day that had secured his conquest but had haunted him ever since. War was an ugly, brutal business. No, he said at last. Let them flee. If any attempt to rally or regroup, we'll strike again. But I will not slaughter men who have no means of fighting back. Let them be an example to the rest of Valyria that we will not be bullied. Visenya landed on a drifting piece of debris with Valyrians, scanning for hostages. She found some who cried out that they were Dragonstone fishermen, forced onto the ship as bargaining chips. Quickly, Targaryen soldiers rode out from the fortress to rescue them. A handful of Valyrian knights risked the flames and sinking decks to find any other captured souls. Most had likely perished when the flagship exploded, but a few survivors were hauled from the water, half drowned. By nightfall, the battle was effectively over. Fires on the water cast a lurid glow that flickered against the sky. The stench of burning pitch and flesh clung to the air. Dragonstone's defenders cheered from the walls, chanting Aegon's name. In the courtyard, soldiers embraced, celebrating what they deemed a great victory. None knew yet whether Elian herself had died or escaped, but the immediate threat was crushed. Aegon, dismounting from Balerion, took stock of his own side's injuries. Valyth's wing was gashed, though not severely. Some archers on the walls had been wounded by return fire. A handful of knights had drowned while attempting to rescue hostages from the wreckage. Overall, though, the cost was far less than it might have been had the Malarian fleet attacked in full force. By the next morning, the Targaryen navy from King's Landing reached Dragonstone, finding only the aftermath of battle. Charred hulks dotted the sea. The survivors of Malarian's armada, perhaps a few scattered ships or lifeboats, had fled eastward. Aegon conferred with his admirals, ordering them to patrol the narrow sea aggressively, ensuring no second wave could approach unnoticed. Visenya, satisfied, paced the castle halls with a triumphant gleam in her eyes. This proves we will not bow. Let them carry the tale back to Valyria. If any other house seeks to force us, they'll meet the same fate. Rhaenys tended to Valyth's injuries, her mood subdued. Yes, but what next? Malarian might be just one faction. If the others unite against us, Aegon stood on a high battlement, the wind ruffling his silver hair. He stared at the horizon where the battle had raged. Let them try. We are not so easy a target. Still, I do not relish a protracted war. Our realm is only just recovering from internal strife. Another wave of dragons could bring devastation. He sighed heavily, recalling how, in another world, the doom would have destroyed Valyria outright, leaving only scattered survivors. Here and now, the city lived on, fractured, dangerous, still brimming with power. Aegon realized that he had carved out a realm in Westeros not merely to escape Valyria's overshadowing might, but to build something new. Perhaps peace with the freehold was a fool's dream, so long as it devoured itself in civil wars and sought to dominate all outsiders. In the days after the battle, the Targaryens learned that the rescued fishermen and minor knights had indeed been slated for exchange. Malarian would have demanded the exiles in King's Landing in return. Now, with the Malarian fleet vanquished, the question arose of whether to anticipate further retaliation. Aegon dispatched swift ships to monitor the sea lanes to Essos. Reports trickled back that the war in Valyria continued, seemingly unaffected by the loss of Ellian's fleet. Some rumored that Ellian herself had perished. Others claimed she had escaped, vowing vengeance. Whatever the truth, Malarian's immediate threat was broken. And in King's Landing, cheers erupted when word spread of Aegon's victory. The exiles, especially, felt a wave of relief. For the moment, none would be forcibly returned to Valyria. But the atmosphere of triumph was tempered by the sobering realization that this might only be the beginning. If other Valyrian houses saw Malarian's defeat as an opportunity to supplant them, new fleets or armies could appear. Aegon issued a realm-wide decree. All lords were to remain vigilant, keep their troops in readiness, and report any sightings of foreign ships. He also announced that Westeros would continue to receive refugees from Valyria, but that the crown would screen them carefully, ensuring no spies or saboteurs slipped in. It was a line of policy that revealed the precarious path he walked, welcoming innocent families, barring hostile elements, and simultaneously preparing for war. As the aftermath settled, Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys returned to King's Landing, greeted by throngs of cheering citizens. The city erupted into celebration, with ribbons and banners hanging in the streets. Many small folk adored the Targaryens' show of strength. Indeed, the common people often rallied around a victorious monarch, regardless of the complexities behind the conflict. The faith hailed the battle as a sign that the Seven blessed Westeros against foreign invaders. In the Red Keep, lavish feasts were held, with lords raising toasts to the Targaryen dragons. Yet in private, Aegon was not quite so jubilant. He knew that the long-term problems remained unsolved. The war in Valyria raged on. Different houses might attempt new strategies, diplomatic infiltration, alliances with discontented Westerosi lords, or a direct dragon-led assault. He could not predict which path they would choose, only that Westeros had now proven it would fight back. And in the quieter corners of the city, some still fretted that the Targaryens had sealed Westeros's fate by inviting so many exiles in the first place. Perhaps a more isolationist king would have turned them away, avoiding all trouble with Valyria. But that would have meant abandoning thousands to slavery or death, which Aegon could not stomach, nor did his queens, despite their different temperaments. In one reflective moment, Aegon stood on the highest terrace of the Red Keep, gazing north toward the distant lands that stretched far beyond the king's immediate purview. Perhaps there, in the stony hills and snowy mountains, lay a safer stronghold if ever the dragons of Valyria truly descended in force. The thought was sobering. For all his power and the fearsome presence of Balerion, he knew Valyria was ancient and vast. If a unified coalition arose there, it could overshadow all else. He drew in a breath, recalling the small child he had comforted among the refugees. Lives were at stake, not just territories on a map. A new future was being forged here, one where Valyria's legacy and Westeros's traditions collided. If he gave in to fear, if he yielded to intimidation, that future would be one of subjugation, endless war, or betrayal of those who had placed their faith in him. So he hardened his resolve. Westeros would stand. For every threat from Valyria, he would answer in strength and principle. That meant forging alliances, building defenses, and ensuring that those who fled tyranny had a place to call home. The realm's unity, so recently won, would be tested by forces from the east. But in the forging fire of these tests, a new identity would emerge, one that was neither purely Valyrian nor purely Westerosi, but Targaryen in the truest sense. The days turned to weeks. In the Great Hall, Aegon passed judgments with the Iron Throne looming behind him, summoning lords, hearing petitions. He oversaw the integration of the exiles into farmland across the Crownlands, some even settling near the Rosby and Duskendale roads to revive neglected fields. Craftsmen from Valyria brought advanced metallurgical techniques that fascinated local smiths. The tensions with the small folk gradually eased, especially once they realized that many refugees contributed valuable skills. Still, not all prejudice vanished overnight. Meanwhile, Rhaenys maintained a careful watch on rumor networks. She learned that some exiles remained in quiet contact with relatives still in Valyria, exchanging coded letters about the war's progress. Rhaenys ensured such communications were monitored. She trusted most exiles, but she refused to be naive. If any of them plotted with foreign factions to sabotage the crown, better to catch it early. Visenya threw herself into strengthening the realm's martial readiness. She commissioned new steelworks, expanded the dragon pit's capacity, and trained her personal guards to handle potential dragon-to-dragon combat. She even experimented with specialized harnesses and armor for Valyrians, though the dragons typically loathed such constraints. Still, the mere notion of outfitting a dragon for war revealed the seriousness of her mindset. As the realm stabilized, a fresh wave of refugees arrived. This time not from Valyria itself, but from lands near its periphery, places like Illyria and Mantares, which had become collateral damage in the ongoing war. People of varied ethnicities and appearances stepped onto Westerosi shores, carrying stories of destruction at the hands of roving Valyrian war bands. It was a grim testament to how far the conflict had spread. Aegon's realm grew even more culturally diverse, forging a patchwork of tongues and traditions in King's Landing. From time to time, a lone Valyrian ship would appear on the horizon, bearing flags of parley. Some sought trade, others brought news or rumor. No large fleets reappeared near Dragonstone, though. Perhaps Malarian's defeat had made them cautious, or perhaps they were too embroiled in battles at home to mount another expedition. Either way, King's Landing breathed a collective sigh of relief as the threat of immediate invasion receded. And yet, there was the matter of legacy. Aegon's line was not firmly entrenched. Though he had a daughter, Enya, by Rhaenys, she was still a small child. Visenya had miscarried once, and thus far had not carried another pregnancy to term. The lords of Westeros generally expected a male heir. Murmurs circulated. What if the king died in battle with Valyria? Who would succeed him? Would Westeros fall back into chaos? To quell such worries, Aegon proclaimed that if he died without a son, Enya would inherit. It was an unprecedented assertion in the eyes of some Westerosi houses, but a few recognized that Targaryen tradition did not forbid female succession if no viable male heir existed. The faith eyed this decision with a mixture of caution and acceptance, uncertain how far to challenge a king with dragons. Beyond succession, Aegon and his queens contemplated another, quieter question. Was there a path to forging genuine peace with a stable Valyria? Could they, by sheltering exiles and standing firm against aggression, help nudge the freehold towards some sort of reconciliation? Or was that hubris, given the centuries of Valyrian domination in Essos? Rhaenys remained slightly more optimistic. Visenya doubted it. Aegon himself wavered day by day. In the meantime, life went on. King's Landing expanded, adopting bits of Valyrian architecture. Curved archways, basalt pillars, mosaic floors reminiscent of the freehold's aesthetic. The new amphitheater opened, hosting pageants that celebrated Targaryen prowess. With the influx of skilled stonecutters from across the sea, the city's skyline began to transform. Cranes rose along the hills near the Blackwater, building new manses for both Westerosi and exiled nobles. Houses half Valyrian, half Westerosi began to emerge, weaving bloodlines that might someday unify the realm in ways no one fully foresaw. Aegon watched these changes with a sense of cautious pride. If they succeeded in forging a unified, multicultural kingdom, it would be something Valyria itself never fully achieved, a realm that integrated rather than merely conquered. At times, he recalled his childhood in the labyrinthine streets of the Freehold, how the might of dragons overshadowed any notion of tolerance or equity. Here, in Westeros, he tried to balance power with a measure of justice. He knew it was an ongoing struggle, and that future generations might not maintain the same balance. But it was worth attempting. During one quiet evening in the Red Keep Solar, Aegon found himself alone with Rhaenys, the candlelight dancing on the polished table. They spoke of the realm's future, the risk of further Valyrian incursions, and the new alliances they might pursue. Rhaenys gently placed a hand over his. "You bear so many burdens, brother," she said softly. "Sometimes I fear you carry the weight of two worlds." He looked at her, seeing the concern in her violet eyes. "Perhaps that is my fate. The boy who once roamed Valyria's spires is now the king in a land half-built on Valyrian dreams. I cannot escape that legacy." She squeezed his hand. "We will share it with you. Visenya and I stand beside you always." He managed a small smile. "I know, and I am grateful. Without you, I might have given in to the darkest impulses of conquest long ago, or bowed before the stronger factions of Valyria." They fell silent, the warmth of their bond lingering in the air. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Taverns closing, watchmen patrolling, exiles dreaming of a better tomorrow. For all the uncertainty, Westeros had grown into something formidable under the Targaryen banner, a realm that Valyria could no longer ignore. Much later, as Aegon stood at the windows overlooking the moonlit bay, he allowed himself a rare moment of hope. Malarian had been driven off. The exiles found a measure of safety here. No unstoppable wave of Valyrian dragons loomed on the horizon, at least for now. If he could steer Westeros through these next years, perhaps the civil war in Valyria would exhaust itself or lead to a new status quo. Perhaps then an enduring peace could blossom across the sea. But if not, Aegon Targaryen, rider of Valyrian, would be ready. He had chosen his path, to defend those who sought his protection and to stand firm against intimidation. He was no longer a lesser scion in the sprawling aristocracy of the Freehold. He was king of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, lord of the Seven Kingdoms, protector of the realm, a conqueror who had carved out his own destiny rather than inherit it. If Valyria insisted on challenging that destiny, he would answer as only a Targaryen could, with flame and blood if need be. Morning came, painting the sky in soft rose and gold. Aegon took a brief flight on Valyrian, circling low over the city. The rooftops glistened with dew, and the waters of the Blackwater Bay sparkled in the dawn light. He spotted fishing skiffs heading out, their sails taut against the breeze. From the Red Keep's ramparts, guards saluted as the Black Dread sword passed, a symbol of royal might. In the distance lay open water, stretching all the way to Essos. Somewhere out there, Valyria smoldered in civil war, while other fleets prowled the seas, uncertain whether to challenge or ignore the rising power in the west. Aegon felt Valyrian's heartbeat through the saddle, steady and strong, like the pulse of the kingdom he had forged. In that moment, he was at peace, content that whatever storms might come, Westeros would face them unbowed. He guided Valyrian back toward the Red Keep, landing amid swirling dust. Rhaenys and Visenya awaited him, each with their own dragons. The three exchanged glances, understanding that their triumvirate remained the cornerstone of the realm's security. No matter what else happened, alliances, trade pacts, or wars, they had each other and their dragons. That was enough for now. Thus continued the reign of Aegon the Conqueror in a world where the doom of Valyria never came. The mighty Freehold lingered across the sea, torn by internal strife, occasionally casting hungry eyes at Westeros. But for every threat, the Targaryen king stood firm, forging a kingdom that absorbed both the wonders and horrors of Valyria without surrendering to them. What the future held, whether further battles, tenuous truces, or a slow drift toward mutual respect, No one could say. In quiet corners of the city, maesters scratched ink on parchment, recording these developments for posterity. They wrote of the day the Malarian fleet was turned to ash by 3 dragons. They wrote of exiles saved from certain doom, weaving their lives into the tapestry of Westeros. They wrote of marriages between Valyrian families and Westerosi nobles, of new skills and crafts that blossomed in the capital, of tensions that threatened to tear it all apart. History, they knew, was never still, and high above it all, in the sky of dawn or twilight, soared the dragons, living embodiments of power, mystery, and transformation. Aegon Targaryen's legacy was etched into their wingbeats, his name carried on the wind with every roar. He might have been a child of Valyria, but he had become something else entirely. The founder of a realm that balanced on the edge between 2 worlds, forging a future that neither continent had fully anticipated. If doom had spared Valyria, it had also given Westeros a new challenge, and perhaps, in that challenge, an unbreakable sense of self. Only time would tell whether the Targaryens and their 7 kingdoms would endure as a beacon of possibility or collapse under the weight of Valyria's endless shadows. But for now, at least, the realm stood unvanquished, a dragon-crowned kingdom brimming with ambition and guarded by the ferocious will of its sovereign. For all the perils that might follow, one truth rang clear in the hearts of those who served or feared Aegon. The conqueror was no mere provincial upstart, but a king forged in the fires of an unbroken empire, and that fire burned in him still, bright enough to light the path through whatever darkness lay ahead.